Snow presses against the windows of London's finest homes, muting the city into something almost holy. Inside, the air is warm with pine, wax, and roast meat. Choirs echo down gaslit streets. Servants glide across carpets. Laughter feels rehearsed, perfect. This is Christmas, as the Victorians wanted it remembered, pure, charitable, upright. But beneath the velvet and evergreen, another ritual unfolds, quieter and far more dangerous. One measured in powders, drops, and carefully timed sips. Before we go any further, take a moment to settle in. If you're watching late at night, or letting this play in the background, let me know where you're listening from. And if you're drawn to these hidden histories, the things polite society tried to bury, subscribe and stay with me. There are many more rooms like this, and none of them are as clean as they appear. Behind closed doors, Christmas in high society was chemically engineered. Cocaine sharpened the mind for long dinners and sharper conversation. Opium dulled grief, quieted nerves, and softened the loneliness of winter. Doctors praised it. Chemists sold it with smiles. Newspapers called it progress. These were not scandals whispered in alleyways. They were indulgences taken beside the fire, wrapped in medical language and moral certainty. Tonight, we lift the curtain on a Victorian Christmas few dared to question. A season of carols and candles, sustained by substances that promised control, comfort, and brilliance, while quietly tightening their grip. Step past the decorations. Breathe in the sweetness beneath the smoke. This is where celebration ends and dependency begins. Snow arrives in London without ceremony. It settles not in drifts, but in fine, patient layers, clinging to window ledges, muffling hoofbeats, softening the sharp iron edges of the city. Gas lamps glow through it like bruised moons, each flame surrounded by a halo of damp light. The streets appear gentler this way, quieter, almost forgiving. Even the smoke rising from chimneys seems slower, heavier, as if the air itself has been sedated for the season. Christmas approaches, and London dresses accordingly. Evergreen wreaths are fastened to doors that rarely open to charity. Shop windows gleam with excess silk ribbons, sugared fruits, silver bells, objects meant to reassure the passerby that prosperity is both abundant and deserved. Inside the grand houses, servants polish until their hands ache, coaxing mirrors into brilliance, carpets into obedience. Everything must shine. Everything must suggest health, warmth, moral certainty. The cold outside is sharp, but indoors it is never allowed to touch the skin. Fires are kept high. Curtains are drawn thick. Rooms fill with the smell of pine needles, wax, roasted meat, and something else faint, medicinal, barely noticed because it has become so familiar. A sweetness that does not belong to food. A bitterness that lingers at the back of the throat. It hides easily among perfumes and spiced wine. Victorian Christmas is not meant to be loud. It is controlled, measured, a performance of calm abundance. Guests arrive precisely on time, wrapped in wool and expectation, stamping snow from their boots before crossing thresholds where fatigue is not permitted. Long dinners stretch into late hours, yet no one is meant to yawn. Conversations sparkle effortlessly. Faces remain composed. The season demands endurance disguised as cheer. This is where the lamps matter most. Their steady glow suggests vigilance, progress, mastery over darkness. But gaslight also flatters. It softens pallor. It hides tremors. It blurs the edges of exhaustion. Beneath it, the human body can pretend for a while longer that it is not failing, not aching, not asking for relief. Doctors move easily through these rooms. They are guests, confidants, arbiters of reassurance. Their presence carries authority, not alarm. When they speak of fatigue, they do not call it weakness. They call it modern strain. When they address sadness, they name it nerves, melancholy, seasonal heaviness. And when they offer solutions, they do so gently, precisely, with the confidence of men who believe deeply in progress. A drop here, a powder there, measured carefully, explained calmly. Not indulgence treatment, not escape restoration. The substances are introduced with the same tone used for discussing tonics or vitamins, framed as temporary aids for a demanding season. Christmas is difficult, after all. It requires energy, presence, grace. And science, it is said, exists to help the body keep pace with expectation. No one speaks of danger. There is no language yet for dependency that fits comfortably into these rooms. What is taken is clean, refined, approved. It comes in glass bottles with neat labels, in papers folded precisely. It does not smell like vice. It does not look like ruin. It looks like help. Outside, snow continues to fall. It quiets the city, presses sound into submission. Carriages roll past, their wheels leaving brief marks before the street smooths itself again. London appears untouched, immaculate. The gas lamps burn on, steady and unwavering, as if promising that nothing beneath their light could ever truly go wrong. But inside, beneath velvet and evergreen, something has already shifted. The season has begun not only to celebrate comfort, but to manufacture it. And the glow that fills these rooms, warm, chemical, persuasive, will not fade with the snow. Christmas, in Victorian London, was never merely a date on the calendar. It was a declaration, a public affirmation that society remained upright, ordered, and benevolent, even as the city swelled, strained, and sickened beneath its own progress. To celebrate Christmas properly was to prove one's moral fitness. To falter during it was quietly unforgivable. The season carried rules as strict as any law. Joy was permitted, but only within boundaries. Pleasure was allowed, but it must appear earned. Excess could exist, provided it was framed as tradition rather than appetite. The festival was meant to cleanse the year's sins through ritual, the charity visit, the church service, the carefully chosen gift. Christmas did not abolish restraint, it rehearsed it. In sermons and newspapers, the holiday was praised as a civilizing force. It softened the harshness of industrial life, restored family bonds, reminded even the ambitious that generosity was a duty. The poor were fed briefly, the lonely were acknowledged symbolically, and the prosperous were reassured that their success could coexist with virtue, so long as they observed the season correctly. Homes became stages for this moral theatre. Dining rooms filled with guests chosen not for intimacy, but for propriety. Seating arrangements reflected social balance. Conversation avoided anything too raw, too political, too honest. Laughter rose on cue. Compliments were exchanged with precision. The appearance of harmony mattered more than the experience of it. For women, the demands were relentless. Christmas required beauty without fatigue, warmth without disorder, attentiveness without complaint. A hostess was expected to move through hours of preparation and performance as if untouched by strain. Her smile could not slip, her hands could not tremble. Her voice must remain light, even when her body pleaded for rest. To appear overwhelmed was to fail not privately, but socially. Men, too, were bound by expectation. They were to be generous without indulgence, jovial without loss of control. The season invited drinking, yet condemned drunkenness. It encouraged sentiment, yet distrusted emotional excess. A gentleman must be animated but composed, present but never vulnerable. The balance was delicate, and winter made it harder. The moral weight of Christmas lay precisely in this tension. It asked the body to perform virtue. It demanded that feeling be regulated, grief postponed, exhaustion ignored. There was little room for fragility beneath the garlands. Sorrow was acceptable only if it was dignified. Fatigue only if it was silent. It was within this framework that chemical assistance found its justification, not as pleasure, but as preservation, not as escape, but as maintenance of moral order. If the season required calm, focus, warmth, and endurance, then anything that provided those qualities could be framed as responsible. A small intervention in service of a larger social good. Medical language slipped easily into holiday conversation. Terms like balance, stimulation, sedation, and nerve support sounded reassuring, modern, controlled. They suggested mastery over the body rather than surrender to it. In a society obsessed with progress, the idea that science could refine celebration felt not only acceptable, but admirable. Christmas thus became a proving ground for modernity. Could tradition survive industry? Could morality endure fatigue? Could joy be sustained without collapse? The answers were increasingly supplied not by faith alone, but by chemistry administered quietly, politely, and with unwavering confidence. The festival glowed with righteousness, but its foundations were already shifting. Beneath hymns and candlelight, beneath the language of virtue and restraint, the season was being chemically reinforced. Christmas remained moral in appearance, but its endurance now depended on substances that promised control, while quietly reshaping the meaning of celebration itself. As daylight fades early in December, London retreats indoors. The streets empty sooner, the cold urging bodies toward warmth and company. By late afternoon, the great houses are already sealed against the night, doors closed, curtains drawn, lamps lit in careful sequence. The drawing room becomes the heart of the season, a controlled environment where winter is excluded and society is distilled. These rooms are designed to soothe. Upholstery absorbs sound, heavy rugs, quiet footsteps. Firelight flickers against gilt frames and polished wood, creating movement without chaos. Everything is arranged to suggest ease, even when ease is the least natural state. Chairs are placed close enough for intimacy, far enough for decorum. Tables hold porcelain cups, crystal decanters, small dishes meant to be sampled endlessly without ever satisfying hunger. It is after dusk that the room changes character. The day's obligations have been discharged. The formal dinner, with its courses and etiquette, has passed. What remains is expectation without structure, hours to be filled with conversation, music, games, and polite endurance. This is the most demanding part of the evening. The body, already tired, is now asked to appear lively. The mind, dulled by repetition, must sparkle anew. Guests lean forward, listening closely, laughing at the right moments. Conversation circles familiar topics, travel, politics softened into anecdote, science rendered harmless. Wit is prized, but never too sharp. Silence is dangerous. It suggests fatigue, disinterest, or something worse, interiority. One must remain engaged, outward, present. The gas lamps glow steadily, but their light is deceptive. It flattens shadows and softens expressions, hiding the strain beneath skin. Pallor becomes elegance. Restlessness reads as animation. The environment conspires to make exhaustion look like refinement, and yet, beneath the calm surface, bodies begin to resist. Legs ache, eyes burn, hands fidget, breaths shorten. It is here, in this gentle resistance, that assistance is first welcomed. A small dose, offered discreetly. A suggestion murmured rather than prescribed. Something to sharpen the senses, to steady the nerves, to keep the evening intact. Not everyone partakes, but enough do that it becomes unremarkable. The act itself is subtle, no dramatic gesture, no visible indulgence. Just a pause, a sip, a powder folded away again. The effect is immediate but quiet. Conversation brightens, fatigue recedes, the room feels warmer, closer, time stretches. The evening regains its shape. No one remarks upon the change, because to do so would be to acknowledge its necessity. The illusion depends on silence. For women, the relief is palpable. The weight of constant composure lifts slightly, thoughts flow more easily, smiles require less effort. For men, confidence sharpens, speech quickens, attention returns. The room hums with renewed energy, and the night continues as planned. These drawing rooms do not feel dangerous, they feel successful. The gathering works, guests linger, hosts are praised, the season proceeds without visible fracture. And because nothing appears to go wrong, nothing is questioned. Yet the dusk has introduced a new rhythm, one not dictated by the clock, but by chemistry. Evenings begin to rely on reinforcement. The body learns that endurance can be supplemented, that weariness is negotiable. What begins as assistance becomes expectation, then habit, then requirement. By the time coats are fetched and farewells exchanged, the night feels strangely unfinished, as if the body has been held artificially awake, suspended beyond its natural limits. Sleep, when it comes, is uneven. Dreams fragment. The mind continues to race, or sinks too deeply, too quickly. The drawing room falls silent again, lamps extinguished one by one. But something lingers in the air, an altered sense of what is possible, of how long a person can perform. After dusk, beneath gaslight and courtesy, the season has learned a new way to sustain itself. The physician no longer waits in the hallway. In earlier generations, he was summoned only in moments of alarm, when breath failed, when fever climbed, when pain announced itself without restraint. But in Victorian London, especially during the Christmas season, the doctor takes a seat at the table. He is invited, expected. His presence is not a sign of illness, but of prudence. He arrives in good spirits, well-dressed, carrying neither bag nor urgency. He compliments the house, he accepts wine. He speaks easily of travel, of new discoveries, of the remarkable pace at which modern knowledge is advancing. To host a doctor at Christmas is to display alignment with progress itself. Medicine, after all, has changed. It no longer belongs solely to the sick room. It has entered polite life. It speaks now of prevention, of balance, of optimizing the body to meet the demands placed upon it. The Victorian physician is not merely a healer of collapse, he is a manager of endurance. At the dinner table, his language is careful and reassuring. He does not speak of danger. He speaks of nerves, of stimulation, of moderation. He explains fatigue as a consequence of refinement, not weakness. Sensitive minds, he says, feel more deeply. Cultured bodies respond more acutely to strain. This is not pathology, it is evidence of advancement. Such ideas land comfortably among the silverware and candles. Guests nod. Hosts feel absolved. If exhaustion is the cost of sophistication, then relief becomes not indulgence, but necessity. The doctor offers this logic generously, never as accusation, always as permission. He may be asked for advice casually, almost jokingly. A lady confides that she has been unusually tired this winter. A gentleman admits to difficulty concentrating after long evenings. The doctor listens, nods, considers. His responses are measured, a tonic, a mild stimulant, a calming draught before sleep. Nothing extreme, nothing alarming. What he prescribes fits neatly into the rhythm of the season. A little energy for the afternoon visits, a little calm for the night, a small adjustment to keep the machinery running smoothly. He emphasizes dosage, precision, control. The very words suggest safety. The substances themselves are spoken of without drama. Cocaine is not framed as a vice, but as a scientific extract, refined and purified. Opium is discussed not as a drug, but as a venerable remedy, trusted for centuries. Ether, chloral, morphine, these names circulate with clinical neutrality, stripped of moral weight. The doctor's authority shields them. If science approves, then conscience need not intervene. And so the physician becomes an invisible architect of the season. He does not administer every dose, but he legitimizes them all. His approval allows chemists to sell without hesitation, families to partake without guilt. What once might have required secrecy now requires only discretion. Crucially, he reassures his hosts that these measures are temporary. Christmas is demanding, he reminds them. The winter is long, social obligations are unusually intense. When the season passes, the need will pass with it. The body will return to equilibrium. It is a comforting promise. What goes unspoken is how easily the body learns new expectations, how quickly it adapts to chemical assistance, how subtly relief becomes routine. The physician does not witness the private moments, the second dose taken without consultation, the unease when a bottle runs low, the restless nights when sleep no longer arrives unaided. At the table, everything appears orderly. The doctor laughs. The guests relax. The holiday proceeds exactly as intended. Medicine has fulfilled its modern role not by curing illness, but by sustaining appearance. And in doing so, it has quietly woven itself into the fabric of celebration, ensuring that Christmas in high society will be remembered as serene, successful, and entirely under control. Even as something else begins to take hold, not every Christmas offering arrived with ribbon or card. Some passed from hand to hand, with no ceremony at all, small, discreet, easily hidden within a sleeve or pocket. They were not displayed beneath the tree, nor announced with gratitude. They required no paper, no bow, no acknowledgement beyond a knowing glance. In a season devoted to exchange, these gifts were the most carefully unmarked. They appeared first as conveniences, a folded paper, a small glass vial, a bottle placed quietly beside the medicine cabinet rather than among the festive clutter. They bore neat labels, written in a confident hand, their contents explained in measured terms. Nothing about them suggested indulgence. They were presented as tools, practical, modern, necessary. To give such a thing was not considered improper. On the contrary, it implied attentiveness. It meant one had noticed fatigue, strain, a faltering composure, and chosen to respond with discretion rather than alarm. This was care expressed in the Victorian idiom, precise, restrained, unembarrassing. A hostess might offer it quietly to a friend who had travelled far. A husband might suggest it to a wife whose duties had multiplied with the season. A doctor might leave it behind after dinner, as casually as a calling card. The exchange was swift and understated, designed to preserve dignity on both sides. These gifts asked for no celebration. They were meant to be used, not admired. What distinguished them from other holiday indulgences was their invisibility. Wine could be seen poured. Food left its traces. These left none, at least, none that could be observed immediately. Their effects were internal, subtle, persuasive. Energy returned. Calm descended. The evening resumed its course without interruption. Because they did not resemble pleasure, they escaped scrutiny. There was no sense of excess, no spectacle of loss of control. One did not become loud or clumsy or undone. One simply continued more smoothly, more brightly, more comfortably than before. In a society obsessed with appearances, this mattered above all else. The language surrounding these gifts was carefully chosen. They were never called stimulants or sedatives in conversation. They were aids, tonics, supports, words that suggested assistance rather than alteration. The implication was clear. Nothing fundamental was being changed. The self remained intact. Only its edges were being reinforced. And yet, these unwrapped gifts carried a quiet intimacy. To accept one was to acknowledge vulnerability without naming it. To use one was to admit privately that the season asked more than the body could give unaided. This acknowledgement was never spoken aloud. It lived in the silence between politeness and necessity. As Christmas progressed, these exchanges became easier. Less explanation was required. The body remembered the relief. The mind anticipated it. What began as generosity slowly acquired expectation. If the season demanded endurance, then endurance would be supplied. There was comfort in this arrangement. The gift worked. The holiday was preserved. No one collapsed. No one caused a scene. The house remained orderly, cheerful, respectable. That success reinforced the practice more powerfully than any medical endorsement. But unlike wrapped presents, these gifts did not end on Christmas morning. They were not consumed and forgotten. They lingered. Bottles remained half full. Papers were tucked away, saved for later. Their presence extended beyond the holiday itself, waiting patiently for the next moment of strain. When January arrived and decorations were taken down, these objects were not discarded with the greenery. They stayed, quiet and accessible, having already proven their worth. What had been offered as seasonal support now stood ready for everyday use. And so the most consequential gifts of the Victorian Christmas were never placed beneath the tree. They passed quietly between hands, unwrapped, uncelebrated, altering the season not through joy or generosity, but through subtle dependence, leaving behind no paper, no ribbon, and no clear moment when they stopped being gifts at all. Winter had a language of its own, and the Victorians listened closely to it. The shortening days, the thickened air, the weight of darkness pressing earlier each afternoon, these were not merely inconveniences of season, but forces believed to act directly upon the body and mind. December was understood as a time when strength ebbed, spirits faltered, and nerves grew thin. Christmas did not interrupt this belief, it merely tried to decorate over it. Fatigue arrived quietly. It settled into the limbs during long afternoons of preparation, tightened the shoulders during endless social obligations, dulled the eyes beneath gaslight. It was not dramatic enough to warrant concern, but persistent enough to demand attention. The body felt heavy in ways sleep did not fully relieve. Mornings required effort, evenings demanded endurance. Grief, too, sharpened in winter. The season invited remembrance, empty chairs, absent voices, traditions carried forward without their original keepers. Cold made loss feel closer. Silence felt deeper. The Victorians spoke of mourning as something that returned with the frost, as if sorrow itself were seasonal, rising with the damp and settling into the chest. To speak openly of this was discouraged. Christmas was meant to console, not expose. The expectation was not that grief would vanish, but that it would be controlled, kept quiet, softened, made presentable. Tears were permissible only in moderation. Melancholy could exist, but only if it did not disrupt the household. It was here that the language of nerves offered an elegant solution. The term was elastic enough to explain exhaustion, sadness, irritability, and restlessness without assigning blame. Winter nerves could be discussed without embarrassment. They suggested sensitivity rather than weakness, refinement rather than failure. A nervous disposition implied that one felt too much, not that one endured too little. Doctors spoke of the nervous system as something strained by modern life, by cities, schedules, expectations. Winter intensified this strain. Less light, less movement, more confinement. The body, they said, required assistance during these months, just as plants required care when deprived of sun. Such reasoning was persuasive. It transformed discomfort into diagnosis. It turned emotional weight into a mechanical problem with chemical solutions. If fatigue and grief were matters of nerves, then nerves could be soothed, sharpened, steadied. Christmas became the season when these ideas found their most willing audience. The demands of the holiday amplified every existing strain. The body was expected to give more at precisely the moment it had least to offer. Chemical relief entered this gap quietly, framed as kindness rather than correction. A stimulant could lift winter heaviness without admitting despair. A sedative could ease grief without requiring confession. One did not need to articulate sorrow if it could be softened pharmacologically. One did not need to rest if energy could be summoned artificially. The solutions were tidy. They left no visible disorder. The relief was real, and that mattered. Winter nerves quieted, fatigue receded, grief blurred at the edges. The house functioned, the season progressed. Success reinforced belief. What was rarely considered was how these measures altered the relationship between body and season. Instead of yielding to winter's limitations, the body was taught to resist them. Instead of accepting fatigue and sorrow as signals, they were treated as malfunctions to be corrected. This shift happened gradually, without announcement. There was no moment when endurance officially replaced rest, when chemical calm officially replaced mourning. It happened dose by dose, evening by evening, as winter wore on, and the body learned that its natural responses were negotiable. By the time Christmas arrived in full trees lit, tables set, schedules packed, the language of winter nerves had already done its work. Fatigue and grief had been acknowledged just enough to justify intervention, then swiftly smoothed away. The season appeared triumphant over darkness, but beneath the surface, something essential had been deferred. Winter had been silenced rather than endured, and the nerves, once soothed, would remember how easily relief had been obtained long after the snow melted and the season released its hold. Sleep, once trusted as the body's natural repair, became increasingly unreliable in Victorian London. The city did not rest easily anymore, and neither did those who lived within it. Gaslight extended the day, trains collapsed distance, letters demanded replies, social calendars filled evenings that had once belonged to quiet. Christmas, rather than slowing this rhythm, intensified it. The season arrived already crowded with obligation. Dinners followed dinners, visits overlapped, nights stretched far beyond what daylight allowed. To retire early was to appear disengaged, ungrateful, or worse, provincial. The modern household was expected to remain alert, responsive, and composed long after the body had asked to stop. Bedrooms reflected this tension. Heavy curtains blocked out the night, but could not silence the mind. The air was warm, sometimes stifling. Fires were banked too high. The city hummed faintly through walls that had never been designed for such density. Sleep, when it came, arrived late and left early. Insomnia was discussed delicately. It was framed not as a failure of rest, but as excess of thought. The mind, overstimulated by progress, refused to quiet. The Victorians spoke of it with a mixture of pride and concern. To sleep poorly was inconvenient, but it was also a sign of engagement, sensitivity, intellect. Christmas aggravated this condition. Late meals disrupted the body's rhythms. Alcohol warmed but unsettled. Excitement lingered too long. Guests departed well past midnight, leaving behind rooms that still glowed, still smelled of smoke and perfume. The house seemed reluctant to settle, as if celebration had altered its very bones. Morning followed too quickly. Servants rose early, schedules resumed. There was little allowance for rest. The expectation was that one would rise composed, ready to perform the next ritual of the season. Fatigue was not an excuse. It was an inconvenience to be managed. This was the environment in which chemical solutions found their clearest purpose. If sleep would not come, it could be summoned. If it came too heavily, it could be lightened. If wakefulness lingered unpleasantly, it could be sharpened into productivity. The night became something to be controlled rather than endured. Sedatives entered bedrooms quietly, a measured draught before bed, a promise of calm. The body sank quickly, deeply, sometimes without dreams. The relief was immediate, seductive. For those who had stared too long at the ceiling, the gift of unconsciousness felt merciful. But this sleep was different. It did not restore so much as it erased. Mornings arrived with heaviness, with a dullness that lingered beneath breakfast and conversation. To counter it, stimulants were introduced, a powder, a tonic, something to lift the fog and return clarity. Thus the cycle began to form not as indulgence, but as necessity. Wakefulness and rest were no longer opposite states, but chemically mediated positions on a spectrum. One did not transition naturally between them. One adjusted. The society that would not sleep learned to manage its exhaustion rather than confront it. Christmas encouraged this behavior by demanding constant presence. There was no sanctioned pause in the festivities, no moment where withdrawal was acceptable. One could not simply step away from the season. The body adapted as best it could. It learned to rely on cues not from daylight or fatigue, but from bottles and papers kept discreetly close. Sleep became conditional. Wakefulness became artificial. Both were maintained just well enough to keep the appearance of health intact. By January, many no longer remembered what unassisted rest felt like. Nights were either restless or chemically silent. Days required assistance to begin. The season that had promised warmth and renewal had instead rewritten the most basic human rhythm. London glowed through the night, its lamps unwavering. And inside its houses, beneath drawn curtains and heavy blankets, a society lay awake or unconscious, learning that sleep, like celebration, could no longer be trusted to happen on its own. Intoxication, in Victorian society, was not condemned outright. It was refined. There existed clear distinctions between what was vulgar and what was acceptable, between the public stumble and the private adjustment. Gin belonged to the street. Beer belonged to the labourer. Drunkenness was a visible failing, a loss of control that exposed appetite where discipline was expected. What high society feared was not intoxication itself, but its appearance. And so, a quieter form emerged, one that left no slurred speech, no flushed disorder, no unsteady gait. It did not announce itself with laughter or collapse. It passed beneath notice, altering sensation without disturbing posture. This was intoxication that respected the rules. Cocaine and opium fit neatly into this moral geometry. They did not resemble excess. They did not disrupt etiquette. They enhanced performance. One sharpened the mind, quickened speech, tightened focus. The other softened distress, smoothed emotion, dulled discomfort. Neither betrayed the user to the room. If anything, they made one more socially successful. This distinction mattered enormously. Victorian respectability was a fragile construct, maintained through constant vigilance. One could drink wine at dinner, but only enough to appear convivial. One could accept brandy by the fire, but never enough to lose command of one's tone. Chemical aids, by contrast, offered results without spectacle. They worked inwardly, invisibly. Medical endorsements sealed their legitimacy. If a substance was prescribed, it could not be a vice. If it was dispensed by a chemist rather than a publican, it belonged to science, not indulgence. This framing absolved users of moral responsibility. They were not seeking pleasure, they were maintaining equilibrium. Christmas amplified this logic. The season invited indulgence, yet demanded control. Long evenings required energy, family gatherings required patience, grief required containment. Chemical assistance allowed all three to coexist. One could be stimulated without becoming unruly, soothed without appearing withdrawn. The language used to describe these effects was carefully neutral. No one spoke of intoxication. They spoke of clarity, calm, steadiness, relief. The body was not altered, it was corrected. The mind was not elevated, it was supported. The vocabulary reassured both speaker and listener that nothing improper was occurring. What made this form of intoxication particularly insidious was its compatibility with routine. One could take a dose and continue exactly as before, hosting, conversing, observing ritual. There was no interruption, no recovery required. The body absorbed the change seamlessly. The day proceeded uninterrupted. Over time, this seamlessness became expectation. If one could feel better without consequence, why endure discomfort at all? If fatigue could be lifted discreetly, Why acknowledge it? The line between need and preference blurred, then dissolved entirely. Respectable intoxication did not feel like surrender. It felt like competence. The individual appeared more composed, more attentive, more capable. Society rewarded these qualities, reinforcing the behavior that produced them. The substances were not blamed for dependency, because dependency did not look like collapse. It looked like success. Even self-awareness failed to intervene. Because the changes were subtle, gradual, they were interpreted as personal variation rather than chemical influence. One believed oneself improved, not altered. The assistance disappeared into identity, and so Victorian high society learned to intoxicate itself without ever admitting the act. It learned to pursue chemical alteration while maintaining moral posture. Christmas, with its demands and its justifications, provided the perfect proving ground. Behind the carols and candles, beneath the discipline of etiquette, intoxication thrived, not loud, not scandalous, but impeccably mannered. A form of excess that left no visible stain, and therefore required no confession. It was not drunkenness they feared. It was being seen. There were tears the season would tolerate, and tears it would not. A single glisten at the corner of the eye during a hymn was acceptable. A pause in the voice while reading a familiar prayer could be forgiven. These were sanctioned displays, brief, contained, quickly mastered. They confirmed sensitivity without threatening order. Anything beyond that unsettled the room. Christmas demanded emotional moderation. It invited memory but not collapse. It acknowledged loss only insofar as it could be folded neatly into ritual. The season prized resilience dressed as grace. To cry openly was to interrupt the performance, to introduce a disorder that could not be politely ignored. Grief, therefore, learned to whisper. It softened its edges, disguised itself as fatigue, hid behind headaches and vague complaints of nerves. The body became the messenger, because the voice could not be. Sorrow migrated inward, where it could be managed privately, ideally without witness. This migration suited the era. Victorian restraint valued interiority, provided it remained invisible. One could feel deeply, but one must not display it. The Christmas household, crowded with guests and obligations, left little space for private unraveling. Bedrooms were temporary refuges, corridors echoed, even solitude felt monitored. Into this pressure stepped chemical quiet, not as erasure, but as smoothing. A draught before supper dulled the sharpness of memory. A powder taken discreetly steadied the breath. The ache remained, but it blurred, as if viewed through frosted glass. Tears receded to a safe distance, held at bay by a controlled numbness that preserved appearance. This was not framed as avoidance. It was framed as consideration. For others, for the children, for the guests who had travelled far, for the season itself. One did not want to dampen Christmas with personal sorrow. Better to carry it silently. Better still, to soften it until it no longer pressed so hard against the chest. The relief was immediate and persuasive. The body relaxed. The face smoothed. Conversation resumed. The room continued. The individual remained present without being fully exposed to what presence demanded. Christmas went on without interruption. Over time, this solution became instinctive. At the first swell of emotion, the body anticipated assistance. Grief learned that it could be quieted chemically, that it need not be endured fully to be survived. The mind learned that crying was optional, that sorrow could be managed without passing through it. There were consequences, but they were subtle. Emotion did not vanish, it flattened. Joy, too, lost some of its sharpness. Laughter became easier, but thinner. Affection persisted, but less urgently. The season felt calmer, more even, less prone to disruption. This calm was praised. It was interpreted as strength. Those who moved through Christmas without visible distress were admired for their composure, their maturity, their fortitude. No one asked what it cost to maintain such smoothness. No one wanted to know. Children observed this quietly. They learned which emotions were welcome and which required suppression. They learned that sorrow could be postponed, that tears were negotiable. The household modeled a version of feeling that was presentable above all else. When the season ended and decorations were taken down, the chemicals did not disappear with them. They remained available, now associated not just with relief, but with propriety. They had proven their usefulness in preserving order. They had prevented scenes. They had kept Christmas intact. The idea that one might endure grief openly began to feel unnecessary, even indulgent. Why suffer when suffering could be muted? Why cry when crying solved nothing? The tools that promised control became integrated into emotional life, shaping not only how grief was expressed, but whether it was permitted at all. Thus, Christmas became quieter not only in sound, but in feeling. It became a season where sorrow learned to stay hidden, chemically restrained beneath courtesy and custom. The carols still played, the candles still burned, and the tears, when they came, did so far from the light, delayed until they no longer belonged to the season that had taught them to wait. The Victorian smile was a discipline. It was practiced in mirrors, refined through repetition, adjusted to suit light and company. It conveyed warmth without surrender, interest without intimacy, pleasure without excess. At Christmas, it became essential. The season required visible cheer, and the smile served as proof that the household and the person was functioning as intended. In drawing rooms and at dinner tables, smiles appeared on cue. They greeted guests, smoothed transitions, masked fatigue. They lingered during stories heard too many times, during toasts delivered too slowly, during evenings that extended beyond the body's patience. A smile could end a conversation without offense. It could deflect inquiry. It could signal that everything was, indeed, well. But winter tested this discipline. The cold tightened muscles, fatigue weighed down the face, grief tugged at the corners of the mouth. Maintaining expression required effort, sometimes more effort than speaking, more effort than silence. And yet, the expectation remained. A faltering smile suggested weakness. A vanished one suggested ingratitude. This was where chemical assistance revealed its most seductive quality. It did not merely alter sensation, it supported performance. Muscles relaxed, tension eased. The face complied. The smile returned steadier, easier, more convincing than before. It held without trembling. It lasted through entire evenings. No one remarked upon it because nothing appeared wrong. On the contrary, the individual seemed improved, more pleasant, more engaged, more at ease. The smile did its work invisibly, and invisibility was its greatest virtue. Over time, the face learned to depend on this assistance. Without it, the muscles felt heavy, uncooperative. The mirror reflected strain that had previously been concealed. The absence of chemical support became noticeable, not as illness, but as a failure to maintain standards. This dependency was rarely acknowledged. It did not announce itself with craving or desperation. It manifested as preference, a sense that things went better with help. That one was more oneself with assistance than without. The line between authentic expression and maintained appearance blurred until it ceased to matter. Christmas reinforced this belief year after year. Each season proved again that composure could be sustained artificially. Each successful holiday validated the method. The body learned that its natural signals, fatigue, sadness, irritation, were obstacles to be managed rather than messages to be heard. The smile, once a response, became an obligation. It no longer reflected feeling, it replaced it. And the substances that supported it were framed not as intrusions, but as collaborators, quiet partners in social success. There were moments, late at night, when the smile finally fell, when the house slept and the face relaxed into something closer to truth. But even then, relief was temporary. Morning would come quickly. Expectations would resume. The mirror would demand its discipline once more. In this way, Victorian Christmas trained its participants not merely to endure discomfort, but to conceal it expertly. The smile became a measure of worth, and anything that helped maintain it acquired moral legitimacy. The season rewarded appearance over authenticity, control over expression, and so the smile held longer than it should have, longer than the body intended. It held through fatigue and grief, through winter and repetition, supported by chemistry and custom alike. It held until the distinction between genuine cheer and maintained composure dissolved entirely. By then, no one could remember when smiling had stopped being effortless, or when it had first required help at all. It arrived quietly, wrapped in distance and promise. Long before it touched a Christmas table in London, the white powder had crossed oceans and empires, carried not as a vice, but as a marvel. Its origins lay far from soot and gaslight, in high, thin air, where leaves were chewed to stave off hunger, fatigue, and cold. By the time it reached Britain, it had been transformed, refined, extracted, renamed. Stripped of ritual and geography, it became something modern. Victorian science greeted it with reverence. Here was a substance that seemed to answer the age's most persistent anxieties. It banished weariness without drunkenness. It sharpened thought without delirium. It promised energy without visible cost. In an era obsessed with progress, such qualities felt miraculous. Medical journals spoke of it in measured excitement. Lectures described its effects with clinical admiration. Cocaine, they said, stimulated the nervous system without corruption. It invigorated without degrading. It restored vigor to the exhausted and clarity to the overburdened. Unlike alcohol, it did not loosen morals. Unlike opium, it did not immediately dull the will. It appeared clean morally and physically. This distinction mattered deeply. Victorian society did not reject pleasure outright. It rejected chaos. Cocaine's appeal lay in its precision. A small amount produced noticeable effect. The mind brightened. Speech quickened. Fatigue retreated. There was no staggering, no slurring, no visible loss of command. The body remained upright, capable, impressive. By the time Christmas approached, cocaine had already found its audience. It circulated first among physicians, academics, and the socially ambitious, those most strained by expectation. December simply expanded its reach. The season demanded stamina, wit, presence. Cocaine promised all three. Chemists stocked it discreetly, presenting it as a scientific preparation rather than a luxury. Labels emphasized purity, dosage, control. The powder was not sold as indulgence, but as assistance, particularly useful during the winter months, when energy lagged and spirits flagged. The logic was seamless. If cold drained vitality, science would restore it. Christmas provided the perfect justification. Long evenings required alertness. Conversations required sharpness. Hosting demanded tirelessness. Cocaine slipped easily into this framework, framed as a seasonal support rather than a habit. One did not take it to feel pleasure. One took it to remain capable. The first experiences were often described with surprise. The return of focus felt exhilarating, but not disruptive. Thoughts aligned. Tasks felt manageable again. The body seemed lighter, more responsive. For individuals accustomed to constant self-regulation, this sensation felt like liberation without consequence. What few considered was how swiftly the body learned this new state. The contrast between assisted and unassisted endurance became noticeable. Fatigue, once tolerated, now felt intrusive. Slowness, once accepted, now seemed unnecessary. Cocaine redefined normal. The powder's distance from its origins helped preserve its innocence. It arrived cleansed of context, framed entirely through British authority. There were no visible victims attached to it, no public scandals yet to tarnish its reputation. It belonged to laboratories and lecture halls, not alleys. And so, as Christmas lights flickered against winter fog, cocaine took its place among the season's quiet supports. It was not toasted, not acknowledged, not celebrated. It simply worked, lifting minds, sustaining evenings, smoothing the demands of celebration. The miracle lay not only in its effect, but in its timing. It arrived precisely when Victorian society needed to believe that exhaustion could be conquered without sacrifice, that progress could outpace the body's limits. For a while, it seemed to do exactly that. The measure was always small. That was part of the reassurance. A pinch, a fraction, something scarcely visible against porcelain or glass. The Victorians trusted measurement. It suggested mastery. A teaspoon implied moderation, science, and control. Everything indulgence was not. Cocaine was introduced not as an indulgence, but as a correction. Fatigue, after all, was increasingly framed as a malfunction of modern life rather than a natural boundary. Cities moved faster. Minds were asked to work longer. Social obligations expanded beyond daylight. The body, expected to keep pace, began to lag. The powder promised alignment. Taken in such modest quantity, its effects felt almost polite. There was no jolt, no violence to the senses. Instead, the mind sharpened as if a veil had been lifted. The fog receded. Words arrived more readily. Tasks that had felt heavy regained structure and appeal. It was not exhilaration so much as restoration, the sense of returning to a version of oneself that felt competent and alert. This distinction mattered deeply. To feel artificially stimulated would have been alarming. To feel restored felt justified. Cocaine was praised precisely because it did not announce itself. One did not appear altered, one simply functioned better. Christmas offered countless opportunities to test this promise. Mornings that followed late nights, afternoons spent receiving visitors, evenings that demanded charm and attention long after the body's reserves had been spent. A teaspoon's worth of energy made these transitions possible. It bridged gaps that sleep could not. Hosts relied on it quietly. So did guests. The season's rhythm, wake early, perform constantly, retire late, became manageable through careful reinforcement. The powder did not replace rest, it postponed its necessity. That postponement felt like victory. Medical language supported this use. Cocaine was described as stimulating the nervous system without exhausting it, energizing without depletion. Fatigue, doctors argued, often resulted from inefficiency rather than overwork. The body, properly assisted, could perform longer without harm. Christmas, with its intensity and duration, was held up as evidence of this theory's success. Those who used it regularly noticed subtle shifts. Appetite dulled. Sleep arrived unevenly. The mind felt restless, even in stillness. But these changes were interpreted as side effects of the season itself: too much excitement, too much activity, too little daylight. The powder was not blamed. It was credited for holding things together. As days passed, the teaspoon's measure began to feel precise but insufficient. Not because its effects vanished entirely, but because expectations had risen. What had once felt like abundance now felt like maintenance. The body adjusted. Energy without assistance began to feel like absence. Still, no alarm sounded. There were no obvious signs of collapse. Social obligations were met. Appearances were preserved. Success reinforced belief. If the powder allowed one to meet expectations without visible cost, then it could not be dangerous. What went unnoticed was how the definition of normal had shifted. Fatigue was no longer something to be endured, it was something to be corrected. The body's signals were treated as inconveniences rather than instructions. Energy became a resource to be administered rather than replenished. The teaspoon, small and reassuring, became a symbol of this new arrangement. It represented the idea that human limits could be negotiated, that restraint could coexist with chemical enhancement, that progress required assistance but not admission. By the time Christmas reached its height, energy flowed not from rest or joy, but from routine supplementation. The season remained bright, busy, impressive. No one asked how long it could be sustained. They did not need to. The teaspoon was ready. The Victorians prized conversation not as pastime, but as performance. Speech was expected to move with precision, wit arriving at exactly the right moment, insight offered without labor, humor sharpened but never crude. A successful evening was measured less by what was eaten than by what was said and how effortlessly it appeared to be said. To speak well was to signal education, breeding, control. Christmas intensified this expectation. Drawing rooms filled with mixed company relatives, acquaintances, professional allies, each requiring a different register of speech. One was expected to shift seamlessly between warmth and restraint, intelligence and charm. Silence was suspicious. Hesitation suggested dullness. Fatigue, though universal, was not an acceptable excuse. Cocaine slipped into this environment with unnerving ease. Taken in small, careful measure, it did not force speech. It invited it. Thoughts arrived faster, lined up neatly, eager to be expressed. Words came without searching. Anecdotes sharpened themselves. Connections formed quickly, effortlessly. Conversation felt less like labor and more like flow. This was intoxicating in the most respectable sense of the word. Those who experienced it spoke privately of feeling unusually present, attuned to the room, responsive to cues, able to follow multiple threads of discussion without strain. The mind felt agile, alert, superior. The dull drag of mental fatigue lifted, replaced by a sensation of capability that felt earned rather than artificial. Because the change was internal, it went unnoticed by others except in its results. Guests appeared more engaging, hosts more attentive. Even familiar figures seemed momentarily improved, as if some latent brilliance had finally been unlocked. Compliments followed. Reputations benefited. Success reinforced behavior. Christmas gatherings rewarded this brilliance immediately. Laughter spread more easily. Evenings passed without awkward pauses. The social machinery ran smoothly, each participant playing their part with precision. No one questioned the source of this ease. They simply enjoyed its effects. Importantly, cocaine did not disrupt etiquette. It did not loosen tongues into indiscretion. It did not provoke emotional excess. Instead, it sharpened self-control while enhancing output. One spoke more, but said less that required apology. The mind raced, but remained guided by social instinct. This balance was crucial. Victorian society feared loss of restraint above all else. A substance that stimulated without destabilizing felt like an evolutionary advancement, a chemical refinement of human potential. What went largely unnoticed was how quickly this brilliance became expected. After one evening of effortless conversation, returning to natural pace felt frustrating. Words came slower. Attention wandered. The contrast was unmistakable. The body learned that eloquence could be assisted, that sharpness was no longer solely a matter of rest or talent. Hosts began to anticipate this assistance, not consciously, not openly, but in practice. Evenings were planned longer. Guests were seated strategically. Expectations rose. The assumption was that everyone would remain engaged until the final farewell. Those who declined assistance, or who had not yet discovered it, felt the difference keenly. They grew quiet sooner. They tired visibly. Their contributions diminished. In a society that equated verbal agility with worth, this silence carried consequence. Cocaine quietly redrew the hierarchy of the room. Those chemically assisted appeared brighter, quicker, more interesting. Those who were not seemed merely human. Because this brilliance did not announce its source, it reshaped perception itself. Individuals credited themselves for the improvement. They believed they had accessed a truer version of their intellect, one unburdened by fatigue. The powder disappeared into identity. Christmas passed in a blur of sparkling conversation, its success attributed to good company and festive spirit. The chemical scaffolding beneath it remained invisible, unacknowledged, unquestioned. When the season ended, the memory lingered not of the powder, but of the feeling, the ease, the sharpness, the sense of being fully alive in the room. And once conversation had been made brilliant by artificial means, it became difficult to accept anything less. Victorian womanhood was built on contradiction. A lady was expected to be delicate, yet tireless, fragile in constitution, yet endlessly capable. She was to embody softness without weakness, endurance without visible effort. Christmas intensified these expectations until they pressed tightly against the body itself. The season belonged to her labor, though it rarely bore her name. Decorations were arranged, menus planned, guests remembered, servants directed. Emotions were managed, her own and everyone else's. She was expected to absorb discomfort quietly, smoothing the household's experience without drawing attention to her own fatigue. Lace concealed strain beautifully. Corsets enforced posture. Dresses restricted breath and movement, demanding grace even as the body protested. By afternoon, shoulders ached. By evening, the weight of fabric felt punitive, yet withdrawal was not permitted. A hostess was expected to circulate, to attend, to smile. Her presence was the atmosphere of the house. Medical thinking offered a convenient explanation for the exhaustion that followed. Women, it was said, possessed finer nerves. Their sensitivity made them more responsive to stimulus and more vulnerable to strain. Fatigue was not failure, it was biological destiny. The implication was subtle, but powerful. Assistance was not indulgence, but accommodation. Cocaine entered this space as a solution uniquely suited to expectation. It sharpened attention without masculinizing behavior. It offered energy without aggression. The body felt lighter, the mind clearer, the endless list of small demands suddenly manageable. The effect was quiet, internal, precisely what respectability required. Women used it discreetly, a measured dose before receiving guests, a small amount to steady the afternoon. It did not alter demeanor, it preserved it. Conversation flowed more easily. Irritation receded. The sharp edges of fatigue softened enough to remain hidden beneath courtesy. Importantly, cocaine did not disrupt the performance of femininity. It did not produce loudness or abandon. Instead, it enhanced compliance. A woman could remain composed longer, attentive longer, present longer. The household benefited. Guests noticed nothing except her success. Society rewarded this endurance generously. A hostess who seemed effortless was admired. A woman who maintained elegance through long evenings earned quiet praise. No one questioned how this was achieved. The result mattered more than the method. The danger lay in how seamlessly the substance aligned with expectation. It did not challenge the role imposed upon women, it enabled it. Rather than prompting reconsideration of unreasonable demands, it provided the means to meet them without complaint. Fatigue became manageable. Limits became negotiable. Over time, the absence of assistance felt conspicuous. Without it, irritability crept in sooner. Attention flagged. The body rebelled. The contrast reinforced dependence, not through desperation, but through preference. One functioned better with help. That was enough. Christmas, repeated year after year, solidified this pattern. Each season proved again that endurance could be manufactured. The household ran smoothly, appearances held. The woman fulfilled her role perfectly. What remained unspoken was the cost. Sensations dulled. Natural rhythms were disrupted. The line between rest and stimulation blurred. But these consequences were private, easily concealed beneath fabric and ritual. Victorian society praised the image of the tireless woman without asking how such tirelessness was sustained. Lace hid the truth well, and beneath it, alertness was no longer natural, it was administered. The season glowed with elegance, upheld by women who moved through it gracefully, chemically supported, and quietly exhausted, never permitted to falter, and increasingly unable to stop. Permission mattered. In Victorian society, morality often hinged not on action, but on endorsement. What a doctor sanctioned could not easily be condemned. What medicine framed as treatment escaped the scrutiny reserved for indulgence. And so, when cocaine entered the household with the physician's approval, it crossed an invisible threshold from questionable novelty to respectable necessity. Doctors spoke with confidence born of progress. Chemistry, they said, had finally caught up with modern life. The nervous system, long misunderstood, could now be managed with precision. Cocaine was presented as evidence of this mastery, refined, measurable, effective. Unlike older remedies clouded by superstition or habit, it arrived bearing the language of laboratories and lectures. Consultations during the Christmas season took on a particular tone. Fatigue was expected. Irritability was understandable. Difficulty concentrating was framed as seasonal strain rather than warning. The doctor listened, nodded, and responded not with alarm, but with reassurance. The solution was modest, temporary, controlled. He emphasized moderation, dosage, timing. The implication was that danger lay not in the substance itself, but in misuse, a problem attributed to the careless or uneducated, never to his own patients. His approval created a protective boundary. Within it, use felt safe. Prescriptions were written neatly, without drama. Sometimes they were barely prescriptions at all, suggestions offered conversationally, as one might recommend a change of diet or air. The substance's authority flowed directly from the physician's calm demeanor. If he was untroubled, there was no reason to worry. This approval carried weight beyond the consulting room. It traveled into drawing rooms, into private decisions, into habits formed without reflection. A substance endorsed by science did not require moral negotiation. It became part of the household's rational order. Christmas accelerated this process. The season created ideal conditions for medical endorsement to translate into routine use. The doctor's assurances aligned perfectly with the household's needs. The relief was immediate. The holiday succeeded. Nothing appeared to go wrong. Over time, the physician's role shifted subtly. He was no longer merely treating symptoms. He was maintaining performance. His approval allowed patients to meet expectations without altering them. Fatigue was not a signal to rest, it was a cue for adjustment. Grief was not something to process, it was something to soften. Difficulty sleeping was not a boundary, it was a technical problem. Doctors rarely witnessed the cumulative effects. They saw patients briefly, episodically, often during moments of strain rather than collapse. Improvements were reported, complaints subsided. The treatment appeared successful. Any emerging discomfort was attributed to nerves, to weather, to the unavoidable pressures of modern life. The physician's confidence insulated the practice from doubt. If consequences emerged later, they were rarely connected to the original approval. Memory softened responsibility. The endorsement remained unchallenged. In this way, medical authority became the final seal on cocaine's respectability. It transformed a powerful substance into a tool of compliance, one that allowed society to continue demanding endurance without confronting its cost. Christmas passed again and again, each year reaffirming the arrangement. The doctor approved, the household complied, appearances held. And because approval had been granted at the beginning, No one thought to question the ending. By December, the chemist's shop took on a particular rhythm. The bell above the door rang more often. Footsteps paused longer at the counter. Requests were phrased carefully. Voices lowered just enough to signal discretion without secrecy. The holiday season brought not only prescriptions, but anticipation, a quiet certainty that the winter would require assistance. Victorian chemists occupied a peculiar position. They were merchants, yet cloaked in science. Their shelves held both remedies and assurances, neatly arranged behind polished glass. Labels were precise, measures exact. The environment itself suggested order, control, and trust. To step inside was to enter a space where substances were managed, not abused. At Christmas, demand swelled, not dramatically, not scandalously steadily. Regular customers returned more frequently. New faces appeared, often with the same vague complaints: fatigue, nerves, difficulty concentrating, trouble sleeping. The chemist listened without judgment. These were familiar seasonal ailments. He had prepared for them. Powders were weighed with care, bottles filled slowly, deliberately. The ritual of preparation reassured both buyer and seller that nothing improper was occurring. Measurement was morality made visible. A substance precisely portioned could not be dangerous, not in the hands of a professional. Holiday demand rarely announced itself as indulgence. It arrived framed as necessity: long journeys, family obligations, social strain, the winter cold. The explanations were many, and the chemist required none of them to be detailed. He understood the season. Everyone did. Cocaine and opium were not hidden. They were not pushed. They were available, presented as part of a broader pharmacological landscape, a stimulant for alertness, a sedative for rest, each with its place, its time, its justification. The chemist's role was not to question, but to supply responsibly. What made this exchange particularly powerful was its civility. There was no spectacle, no transaction that resembled vice. Customers did not linger. They did not haggle. They did not appear ashamed. They paid, thanked, and left. Their purchases wrapped plainly, indistinguishable from any other remedy. Christmas sharpened this civility. The season encouraged preparation, foresight, self-management. One did not wait to be overwhelmed. One anticipated strain and responded in advance. The chemist facilitated this prudence, becoming an unspoken partner in the holiday's success. Behind the counter, records were kept, quantities noted, prescriptions filed. Everything appeared in order. The chemist could point to documentation if needed, proof that nothing was excessive, nothing irresponsible. This paperwork provided moral cover, insulating the practice from scrutiny. What no ledger captured was frequency, the slow increase in visits, the subtle shift from occasional to routine, the way customers returned sooner than before, asking for refills with practiced ease. These changes were gradual, unremarkable. The chemist saw them, but saw no reason to intervene. Demand created its own logic. Holiday profits rose modestly, predictably. No windfalls, no scandals, just steady business conducted in quiet tones beneath garlands and gaslight. The chemist's shop became another site of seasonal preparation, as essential as the butcher or the grocer. When Christmas ended, the demand did not vanish entirely. Winter lingered. So did habits formed under its pressure. Customers continued to return, now citing work, travel, lingering fatigue. The chemist adjusted stock accordingly. What had been seasonal became normalized. In this way, the chemist's counter served as a hinge between science and society. It translated medical approval into daily practice. It made powerful substances accessible without appearing permissive. It allowed the season's chemical scaffolding to be assembled quietly, efficiently, and without alarm. As the year turned and decorations were taken down, the bell above the door continued to ring. The winter, had done its work. And the chemist, calm and precise, stood ready, supplying not celebration, but the means to endure it. The Christmas ball was meant to conclude. It was designed with an arc. Arrival beneath lamplight, the swell of music, the measured intoxication of movement and sound, then the gradual easing toward farewell. Midnight marked the threshold. Beyond it, energy was supposed to soften. Guests would depart wrapped in coats and satisfaction, carrying the pleasant fatigue of a night well spent. But increasingly, the night refused to end. Gaslight extended the illusion of endless evening. Music resumed after pauses, meant for rest. Conversations, sharpened earlier, found new momentum. The clock advanced, yet the room remained alert, humming with a vitality that felt both exhilarating and faintly unnatural. Christmas balls stretched past expectation not once, but repeatedly. What had been an exception became precedent. Hosts noticed it first. Guests lingered longer, danced later, resisted departure. There was no complaint of weariness, no visible sag in posture. On the contrary, faces remained bright, steps steady, laughter sustained. The season praised this endurance. A ball that lasted until dawn was spoken of admiringly. It suggested success, abundance, modernity. To conclude early began to feel inadequate, even embarrassing. If the guests could continue, why should the host stop them? The body's natural limits had once enforced closure. Legs tired, breath shortened, attention waned. Now these signals arrived muted, delayed, negotiated away. Chemical assistance, taken discreetly throughout the evening, held the night together. Small reinforcements, extended pleasure, without disrupting decorum. Dancing became less about movement and more about stamina. Couples circled the floor long after their muscles should have protested. The mind stayed alert, the rhythm compelling. Sweat was minimal. Fatigue remained distant. The ball floated forward on borrowed energy. This endurance altered the atmosphere of celebration. Where once there had been crescendos and rests, there was now continuity. The night lost its shape. Time flattened. Guests could no longer sense when they should leave, only that they could stay. Hosts adapted quickly. Refreshments were replenished. Musicians were encouraged to continue. Fires were stoked. The household bent itself around the extended night. Servants moving silently to sustain an event that no longer obeyed its original boundaries. What had been festive now became sustained. Pleasure stretched thin but persistent, held in place by chemistry rather than rhythm. The joy did not deepen, it stabilized. The ball did not crescendo, it plateaued. By the early hours, a peculiar stillness crept into the room. Not silence, but sameness. Laughter continued, but without surprise. Movement persisted, but without release. The body was present, active, obedient, yet strangely detached from the passage of time. Those who stepped outside into the cold felt the difference sharply. The air shocked the lungs. The dark reminded them of hour and season. Returning inside felt like re-entering a bubble where night had been suspended artificially. When the ball finally ended, it did so without resolution. Guests departed not with the satisfied exhaustion of celebration, but with a restless alertness that followed them home. Sleep arrived unevenly. Dreams fractured. Morning came too soon. The memory of the ball lingered not as delight, but as duration. It was remembered for how long it lasted, not how deeply it was felt. Endurance replaced experience as the measure of success. And so the Christmas ball became something new, an event no longer governed by the body's signals, but by the availability of reinforcement. The night could continue as long as assistance was supplied. Closure was optional. Limits were adjustable. What had once been a seasonal indulgence began to resemble a rehearsal for a different kind of living one, in which celebration did not end because it no longer knew how to stop. The ball drifted on, year after year, its music echoing longer than it should have, sustained not by joy alone, but by the quiet certainty that fatigue no longer had the final say. The collapse did not arrive with spectacle. It came quietly, after the last guest had gone, after the candles were pinched out and the greenery began to dry. The house, so recently alive with movement and sound, settled into a brittle stillness. It was there, in the absence of applause and expectation, that the body finally spoke. Morning light revealed it first. Limbs felt heavy, as if weighted from within. The head ached with a dull persistence that resisted breakfast and fresh air alike. Thoughts, once so agile, moved sluggishly, colliding instead of connecting. The brilliance of the previous evenings had drained away, leaving behind an unremarkable exhaustion that felt oddly profound. This was not the familiar tiredness that followed celebration. It was deeper, sharper, tinged with irritability and unease. Sleep, when it came, had been fractured too shallow or too heavy, leaving the body unrestored. Waking offered no relief. The day began already behind. Christmas greenery framed this discomfort cruelly. Holly still crowned the mantel. Wreaths still hung, brittle and fragrant. Decorations spoke of cheer and completion, while the body felt unfinished, depleted. The contrast was unsettling. Those affected struggled to explain the sensation. It was not illness, exactly. There was no fever, no obvious injury. Doctors would call it nerves, perhaps, or a reaction to overexertion. The language softened the reality, allowing the household to proceed without alarm. But something had shifted. The substances that had sustained the season had receded, leaving the nervous system exposed. Stimulation had faded, revealing not equilibrium, but absence. Calm had lifted, revealing rawness beneath. The body, having been held aloft artificially, now dropped. Irritability surfaced without warning. Small inconveniences provoked outsized responses. Sound grated, light felt harsh, conversation exhausted rather than engaged. The very social contact that had once been effortless now felt intrusive. Emotion, too, returned unevenly. Not sorrow exactly, but a flatness punctuated by sudden unease. The mind searched for the clarity it had recently known, and found only fog. Memory felt unreliable. Confidence wavered. The household interpreted this as post-holiday malaise. Everyone felt it, they said. Christmas always left one drained. The explanation was comforting, communal. It discouraged scrutiny. Yet the crash was sharper for those who had relied most heavily on assistance. Their bodies had adapted quickly, expecting reinforcement that no longer arrived. Without it, fatigue did not merely return, it asserted itself. The temptation to correct this state emerged almost immediately. The logic was familiar. If energy had been restored before, it could be restored again. If calm had been achieved chemically, it could be summoned once more. The crash did not discourage use. It invited it. A small dose promised relief, and it delivered temporarily. The fog lifted, the ache receded, normality seemed to return. The lesson was learned swiftly. Discomfort could be avoided. The body did not need to endure withdrawal. It could be stabilized. This pattern established itself quietly, beneath the lingering decorations. The holly framed not joy, but recovery. The season's aftermath became another justification for continued assistance. One did not stop because the holiday ended. One adjusted. What made this moment pivotal was its invisibility. There were no warnings, no public failures. Life resumed, work continued. Social obligations returned in different form. The crash remained private, managed discreetly through the same means that had postponed it. In this way, Christmas accomplished something unintended. It introduced a cycle: elevation, endurance, collapse, correction. The body learned that extremes could be navigated chemically, that limits were negotiable, that consequences need not be faced directly. The holly stayed a little longer than usual that year. No one noticed when it finally came down. But the lesson remained, etched quietly into habit and expectation. The crash had been survived not by rest, not by reflection, but by repetition. And beneath the evergreen, something far less festive had taken root. What followed the crash was not silence, but disturbance. It crept in through small failures of control hands that shook slightly when lifting a cup, patience that thinned without warning, a temper that flared and vanished before it could be explained. These were not dramatic symptoms. They were subtle, easily dismissed, and therefore far more dangerous. Victorian society had language for such things, and that language was mercifully vague. Nerves, restlessness, overexertion. The terms allowed discomfort to exist without demanding investigation. They suggested temporary imbalance rather than structural change. One could acknowledge them politely and move on. Privately, however, the experience felt sharper. The body no longer responded as expected. Concentration faltered unpredictably. Moments of clarity alternated with agitation. Sleep refused to follow familiar patterns, either eluding the night entirely or arriving too suddenly, too heavily, leaving behind a dull heaviness instead of restoration. The nervous system felt exposed, as if its protective covering had thinned. Small social interactions became exhausting. Conversation irritated rather than engaged. Sound felt intrusive. Light seemed unkind. The very composure once so carefully maintained now required effort disproportionate to the task. This loss of ease carried shame. Victorian culture prized self-command. To appear unsettled was to suggest moral weakness or personal failure. Chemical assistance had allowed individuals to meet expectations flawlessly. Without it, the contrast was stark. The body's resistance felt like betrayal. Tremors were hidden, irritability suppressed. One learned to keep hands folded, voice measured, expression neutral. The discipline of concealment intensified. Shame thrives in silence, and silence was readily available. Doctors, when consulted, offered reassurance without curiosity. Winter nerves lingered, they said. The season had been demanding. Recovery would take time. Perhaps a small adjustment was advisable, nothing drastic, just enough to steady things. The suggestion arrived gently, almost kindly, a return to what had worked before, a correction rather than an escalation. The logic was familiar and comforting. Relief followed quickly. This relief reinforced the pattern. Symptoms were no longer interpreted as warnings, but as indicators that assistance was needed again. The body's protests lost their authority. They became prompts rather than messages. What deepened the shame was how invisible all of this remained to others. Outwardly, life continued. Obligations were met. Appearances held. Success persisted. The struggle existed entirely within the individual, isolated, and therefore unchallengeable. One could not easily confide such discomfort. To admit irritability without cause, tremors without illness, dependency without collapse, these did not fit respectable narratives. They suggested a loss of mastery that Victorian society was unwilling to acknowledge. And so the experience was internalized. One blamed oneself rather than the system that demanded endless performance. The solution, accordingly, was self-management, not reconsideration. Christmas decorations were packed away, the calendar turned, winter remained. The nervous system, altered and sensitive, adjusted to its new equilibrium, one maintained through intermittent correction. Private shame thrived in this environment. It did not demand confession, it demanded discretion. The individual learned to manage symptoms quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. The substances that caused the imbalance now appeared as the only means of preserving normality. What had once been seasonal support had become personal maintenance. The boundary between aid and reliance dissolved quietly, without ceremony. Irritability, tremors, and unease were absorbed into daily life. renamed, minimized, treated. No one collapsed, no scandal emerged. The system appeared intact, but beneath the surface, self-command had been replaced by self-regulation, and shame ensured that the distinction would remain unspoken for a very long time. At first, it had belonged to December. The white powder had entered the household under cover of frost and obligation, justified by late nights, crowded rooms, and the ceremonial endurance demanded by Christmas. It was framed as temporary, a solution tied neatly to the season. When the decorations came down, the assumption was that the need would fade with them. But winter did not end when Christmas did. January arrived with its own demands, duller, less forgiving, stripped of ornament. The city remained cold, the days remained short. Social obligations changed shape but did not disappear. Work resumed. Expectations returned, now without the softening excuse of festivity. The body, altered by weeks of assistance, felt this shift acutely. Energy that had once been summoned easily no longer arrived on its own. Focus dulled sooner. Motivation thinned. The contrast between assisted and unassisted life became impossible to ignore. It was here that the powder revealed its persistence. What had been seasonal support now appeared as correction for an ongoing deficiency. The logic adjusted seamlessly. If December had justified assistance due to excess demand, January justified it due to lack of light, of warmth, of morale. The rationale shifted, but the behavior remained. A small dose restored familiarity. The mind brightened. The day regained structure. The body moved with something resembling confidence again. Relief followed swiftly enough to quiet doubt. No one announced this transition. There was no moment of decision. The powder did not declare itself permanent. It simply remained available, and availability breeds continuity. Chemists noticed the change first. Customers who had appeared only during the holiday season now returned with regularity. Requests were no longer framed as preparation, but as maintenance. The language softened further. A little help to get through the day, a touch of energy for the afternoon. Nothing dramatic. Doctors, when consulted, did not object. Winter, they agreed, lingered. Modern life was taxing. Some constitutions required longer adjustment. The implication remained that use was reasonable so long as it appeared controlled. Christmas, in retrospect, became a proving ground. It had demonstrated that the powder worked. It had shown that endurance could be manufactured. It had introduced the idea that fatigue need not be faced directly. Once that idea took hold, it was difficult to abandon. The body adapted accordingly. Natural rhythms recalibrated around assistance. Days without it felt incomplete, slightly off balance. The absence became noticeable, not as illness, but as inefficiency. One did not feel sick, one felt diminished. This subtle reframing mattered enormously. Illness invites care and rest. Inefficiency invites correction. The powder positioned itself as the solution to inefficiency, not as its cause. Social reinforcement followed. Those who maintained sharpness and energy were rewarded with opportunity and approval. Those who lagged appeared less capable. The system favored continuation. What made this shift particularly insidious was its invisibility. There were no outward signs of excess, no decline dramatic enough to prompt intervention. Life continued at pace. Responsibilities were met. Success persisted, and so the powder slipped quietly from season into routine. It no longer belonged to Christmas alone. It belonged to winter, then to work, then to life as it was now structured. The promise that it would be temporary dissolved without being broken, replaced by a new understanding of what normal required. The Victorians had believed they were borrowing energy from science to survive the season. What they had done, instead, was teach the body a new expectation, one that no longer aligned with rest, but with supplementation. The powder did not demand devotion. It did not insist on excess. It simply refused to remain confined to the moment that had introduced it. And by the time anyone thought to notice, the season had long since ended while the habit quietly, impeccably endured. When the house finally quieted, opium waited. It did not announce itself with urgency or brightness. It belonged to the slower hours, the moments when lamps burned low, when voices softened, when the body at last admitted its weariness. If cocaine had animated the season, laudanum was there to close it, to fold the day inward and make rest feel possible again. By the fire, the bottle caught the light gently. Its glass was dark, respectable, medicinal. There was nothing illicit in its presence. Opium had history on its side. It had soothed pain, eased coughs, calmed children, and settled nerves for generations. It was old, trusted, and deeply woven into domestic life. To use it felt less like experiment and more like inheritance. Christmas made its presence especially welcome. After evenings prolonged beyond natural limits, after stimulation that refused to release its grip, the body required descent. Laudanum offered it smoothly. A measured dose softened the edges of thought, loosened the tension held in muscle and breath. The mind slowed. The day receded. Firelight flickered against walls as the household eased into stillness. Outside, the cold pressed against windows. Inside, warmth gathered thickly, heavy with smoke and quiet. Laudanum fit perfectly into this atmosphere. It did not interrupt the scene. It completed it. Sleep arrived differently under its influence. It came quickly, decisively, without the restless turning that had plagued recent nights. Dreams, if they appeared at all, were muted and distant. The body sank into unconsciousness as if lowered carefully, spared the effort of surrender. This relief felt earned. After endurance came reward. After stimulation came softness. The pairing seemed logical, almost elegant, a balance achieved through chemistry rather than rhythm. Doctors encouraged this framing. Opium, they said, restored equilibrium. It calmed overstimulated nerves, settled the agitation left behind by exertion. Taken responsibly, it was not dangerous. It was corrective. Households adopted it without hesitation. Mothers used it to still their own exhaustion once the day's labor ended. Men relied on it to quiet minds that refused to disengage. Even children were not excluded. Their restlessness, treated with small doses, meant to encourage peace. The fire burned low. The bottle returned to its place. The night passed quietly. Morning, however, told a more complicated story. Waking after laudanum did not always bring clarity. The body felt heavy, slow to respond. Limbs resisted movement. The mind emerged reluctantly, wrapped in a fog that lingered through breakfast and conversation. This heaviness was interpreted as the cost of deep rest, a small price for tranquility. If the fog proved inconvenient, the solution was already known. Stimulation lifted it easily. Cocaine sharpened what opium had softened. The day resumed its pace. The cycle closed neatly. Christmas reinforced this rhythm. Nights grew longer, fires burned brighter. Laudanum became the companion to winter darkness, a chemical hearth that promised warmth without effort. Its use spread quietly, unremarked, because it appeared to solve a problem rather than create one. What few acknowledged was how this altered the meaning of rest. Sleep was no longer something the body arrived at naturally, it was something induced. Quiet was no longer the absence of activity, it was a managed state. Over time, the body began to resist unassisted rest. Without laudanum, nights felt restless, incomplete. The mind hovered at the edge of sleep, unable to cross without help. What had once been comfort became requirement. Still, no alarm sounded. Opium was old. It was familiar. Its dangers were known, but distant, associated with extremes rather than domestic use. Taken by firelight, in measured doses, it felt safe, almost wholesome. Christmas ended. Winter continued. The fire still burned. And each night, as the house settled into silence, Laudanum waited patiently, ready to offer sleep that felt merciful, while quietly teaching the body that mercy would no longer come unassisted. Sleep under laudanum was unlike ordinary rest. It arrived with the certainty of a tide, sweeping the body into darkness without warning or negotiation. The eyelids fell, the muscles slackened, and the mind surrendered before it had learned the rhythm of release. There was no tossing, no turning, no internal negotiation with consciousness. Instead, one sank directly into a state of quiet that felt absolute. The absence of dreams was striking. Nights passed without the flicker of memory, without the sensation of imagined worlds or replayed events. The unconscious mind, usually a companion through shadowed imaginings, receded entirely, leaving behind only the hollowed impression of time spent. When morning arrived, it felt as though the hours had been stolen quietly, leaving the body refreshed in part, yet strangely unanchored in experience. Victorian households interpreted this phenomenon as restorative. The body appeared repaired, eyes opened clearer, limbs moved more obediently. Irritation softened, and the tension accumulated over days of labor and celebration seemed partially erased. It was a mercy of the powder, a kindness disguised as sleep. The fire burned low in the bedside room, casting long shadows across heavy curtains. Outside, frost pressed against the windows, unmoved by warmth or candlelight. The air smelled faintly of pine, smoke, and tincture, a combination that had become familiar. In this chamber, sleep arrived like a visitor long expected, unremarkable in its presence, decisive in its effect. Parents found it useful for children, too. Infants who cried too long, toddlers whose energy outpaced evening meals, all could be soothed into a quiet compliance that seemed almost unnatural. The household achieved a kind of calm previously impossible without such intervention. Sorrow, frustration, and exhaustion were softened. The night passed as though under a gentle, invisible hand. Yet the efficacy of this sleep came at a subtle cost. Without dreams, the mind did not process the day's experiences in the usual way. Emotional impressions were dulled, memory consolidated less reliably. Restored bodies did not always correspond with restored spirits. There was a quiet hollowness, a sense of having passed through hours without fully inhabiting them. The pattern repeated itself. Even adults who had long relied on self-discipline found that nights without chemical assistance were restless and incomplete. The body expected the intervention. When it did not arrive, the mind clung to consciousness. The muscles resisted relaxation. The natural rhythm of night was no longer trusted. This created an imperceptible dependency, not marked by obsession or drama. It emerged gradually, in the silent negotiation between expectation and reality. The body learned to anticipate chemical help, to rely on it to reach a state that had once come naturally. The self, so carefully maintained during long Christmas evenings, now required reinforcement to achieve even basic restoration. Doctors, observing the phenomenon, offered reassurance. Sleep without dreams, they argued, was not harmful if it allowed the body to recover. The mind, they said, would catch up when conditions permitted. And so, within polite society, no caution was urged. Intervention was framed not as indulgence, but as progress. As winter pressed on, this sleep became a household norm. Firelight continued to burn low. Bottles remained ready. The rhythm of unconsciousness, absent imagination, settled into domestic routine. Night after night, laudanum guided the household into darkness, shaping not only the body's rest, but the expectations of what rest required. Time passed. The mind, quiet, observed only its absence. Victorian Christmas carried with it the weight of memory, absent relatives, unfulfilled promises, and the constant awareness of mortality hovered beneath the carols and candlelight. Even in the most celebrated households, sorrow lingered, unspoken but palpable. To acknowledge it openly was considered inappropriate. Tears, if permitted at all, were brief and discreet. The season required endurance, the appearance of cheer, and the suppression of lingering grief. Laudanum entered these moments as a quiet ally. Its effect was subtle yet transformative, allowing households to navigate loss without visible collapse. The substance did not erase sorrow, it softened it, blurring sharp edges and dulling the ache that normally accompanied reflection. Mourning became something that could be observed without disruption, a private state made manageable. The mechanics of this management were both elegant and insidious. A small measure at the right moment before dinner, after a long day of visits, during the lull, after music smoothed nerves that were frayed by fatigue and remembrance alike. The mind, freed from the immediate pressure of feeling, allowed the household to continue. Conversation flowed, laughter, carefully modulated, returned. The scene preserved itself. Children, too, were swept into this rhythm. The infant who cried too long, the toddler distressed by the absence of a favorite relative, could be soothed into compliance without moral questioning. The household gained calm. Christmas remained orderly. The body, at least, seemed restored. Emotions were deferred or dampened. Yet beneath this control lay complexity. Relief came at the cost of awareness. Mourning was still present, but altered its rawness, transformed into something quiet, digestible, and socially acceptable. The individual experienced comfort, but not catharsis. The grief remained unprocessed, deferred into the fog of chemical assistance. Victorian sensibilities prized this restraint. Emotion that could be contained, managed, and made aesthetically acceptable was superior to the unregulated expression of sorrow. Laudanum provided a means to achieve this ideal. It allowed women and men alike to navigate family gatherings without visible fracture, to maintain composure while honoring, in a controlled way, the memory of absence. Doctors reinforced this interpretation. The nervous system, they claimed, was delicate. Sensitivity to loss was natural, even inevitable. Chemical aid was not indulgent, but restorative, an instrument of propriety as much as medicine. Families trusted these pronouncements. Use became routine, quietly justified, morally sanctioned. Over time, reliance on such aid subtly reshaped the household. Mourning was no longer a force to navigate directly. It became something adjustable, something mediated. Loss could be felt only to the extent that it did not disrupt appearances. The body learned to anticipate assistance, to rely on it in moments of emotional strain. The consequences were invisible to the wider world. Christmas was celebrated, gratitude was expressed, traditions continued. Yet, internally, the rhythm of emotion had changed. Where grief had once demanded attention, it now yielded to chemical management. Reflection, if it occurred, happened at a pace dictated not by the mind or the heart, but by the measured presence of laudanum. By the end of the season, mourning had been transformed into endurance. Loss was acknowledged, but on terms that preserved order and propriety. The household emerged intact, the façade of cheer sustained, and the body and the mind softened enough to continue. Behind the firelight, behind the laughter, the winter grief remained, managed, quieted, and made bearable. Victorian nurseries were not havens. They were battlegrounds where fatigue, hunger, and expectation collided. The demands on mothers during the holiday season were extraordinary. Children were to be fed, soothed, and entertained. Rooms had to be kept orderly, tasks completed with precision, and appearances maintained despite exhaustion. Christmas intensified these obligations, transforming domestic spaces into stages of continuous performance. The season required composure. Children, whose energy was relentless, demanded attention at every hour. Even brief interruptions of sound or movement could be perceived as failure. Mothers absorbed this pressure silently, aligning their own rhythms to those of the household. One could not flinch at noise, nor falter at exhaustion. The body was trained to endure, the mind to suppress complaint. It was within this relentless structure that chemical aid found its most discreet application. Laudanum, administered in carefully measured doses, offered mothers the possibility of calm. A crying infant became manageable, a restless toddler docile. The household's rhythm stabilized. Noise, chaos, and fatigue were softened without visible effort. The remedy was not indulgence, it was utility, a tool for maintaining order when natural capacity was stretched too thin. Children experienced the effect differently, though no less profoundly. Restlessness was quieted, tears curtailed, appetite normalized. The body slowed, nerves dampened, and sleep arrived more readily. Within minutes, rooms that had been noisy and exhausting became bearable. The air of the nursery, once sharp with tension, softened into something almost gentle, scented faintly with powder, coal smoke, and pine. The illusion of ease prevailed. Mothers, for their part, experienced relief that felt both immediate and essential. The body's constant strain was muted, muscles relaxed. The mind, long held taut by responsibility, could rest even as it continued to supervise. Energy persisted for the social obligations beyond the nursery walls. Laughter and conversation remained poised for the drawing room. Attendance at the Christmas table could continue without the obvious toll of exhaustion. Composure, the most valued currency of high society, was maintained. Yet the comfort was conditional. Relief arrived only through administration. The body, having learned to rely on these interventions, no longer responded naturally. Sleep, patience, attentiveness previously innate became contingent upon dosage. Dependency, though invisible, grew quietly, reinforced by the expectation that mothers must meet impossible standards without faltering. The social consequences were immediate. Mothers who maintained calm were admired. Children who remained quiet reinforced the perception of competency. The household operated with the seamless efficiency of machinery. Success validated the methods, obscuring the means. Chemical aid was normalized, its presence invisible yet essential. By the end of the holiday season, the pattern was established. Winter had revealed not only the limits of natural endurance, but also the invisible scaffolding that had been erected to surpass them. The chemical reinforcement that began as temporary support had become integral, shaping behavior, perception, and expectation. In quiet moments, mothers understood this reality instinctively. They knew that composure had been purchased at the cost of dependence, that the body's natural rhythms had been overridden for the sake of propriety. Yet there was no alternative. The season demanded performance. Survival, both social and domestic, required intervention. Christmas ended, but its lessons endured. Children had been quieted, mothers calmed, and the household preserved. Order had been maintained through powder and patience, through careful administration and meticulous observation. And in the glow of the extinguished fire, beneath the lingering scent of pine and coal smoke, the cycle of expectation, endurance, and chemical assistance had quietly embedded itself into the rhythm of domestic life. The doctor's advice came softly, almost as if it were an afterthought, yet it carried the weight of authority. In Victorian society, the physician occupied a position both enviable and feared. He was arbiter of health, custodian of propriety, and gatekeeper to chemical intervention. At Christmas, his role shifted subtly but decisively. The season demanded endurance, attention, and composure. The body, taxed by festivity and expectation, required guidance beyond natural capacity. The doctor supplied it. Visits were brief, ceremonial in manner, yet precise in effect. He arrived, acknowledged the household with politeness, and inquired into fatigue, mood, appetite. His questions were framed not to alarm, but to elicit careful honesty. Symptoms were spoken of in neutral terms: overexertion, nerves, winter, melancholy. These labels softened the reality of exhaustion, transforming it into a manageable, respectable condition. The recommendation followed naturally: a small, measured dose. Perhaps a stimulant in the afternoon to maintain alertness through evening gatherings. Perhaps a sedative at night to facilitate the body's return to rest. Each suggestion was accompanied by instructions of precision dosage, timing, method. Nothing was excessive, nothing alarming. Authority lent confidence. The effect was immediate yet unobtrusive. Fatigue receded, attention sharpened, irritability softened. The household moved with renewed fluidity. Conversation regained its sparkle. The children's restlessness diminished. The mother's composure returned. It was as if the doctor's presence extended beyond words, a quiet assurance that the household could meet the demands imposed by season and society alike. Crucially, the intervention preserved appearances. No one stumbled, no voice cracked, no visible sign betrayed the reliance on chemical aid. The powder and draughts became invisible partners, facilitating performance without spectacle. Victorian propriety was satisfied, and the household's delicate equilibrium remained intact. The doctor's gentle dose carried subtler lessons. It taught the body to anticipate assistance, to adapt to a rhythm partially imposed by external intervention. Sleep, attention, mood all began to respond not solely to natural signals, but to the expectation of correction. Fatigue no longer marked the limit of endurance. It became a signal that adjustment was required. Socially, the approval of the physician sanctified the practice. What might have been indulgence, even vice, became medicine. The legitimacy of use lay in professional endorsement. Hosts could provide assistance without fear of moral judgment. Guests could accept it without embarrassment. The household could maintain the veneer of composure without acknowledging the cost beneath it. Over time, the cycle became habitual. Small doses punctuated the day and night, each aligned with the body's perceived need. Assistance was available before demand became urgent. The household learned that performance could be chemically supported without visible consequence. The season itself, demanding and exacting, reinforced the practice, embedding it into the domestic rhythm. Even as Christmas faded, the effects persisted. Rest became assisted. Alertness required reinforcement. The body had learned a new set of expectations, calibrated by authority, validated by necessity. What had begun as seasonal support quietly transformed into routine management. And so the physician's gentle dose, administered with courtesy, framed with propriety, and received with gratitude, did more than relieve fatigue or sharpen attention. It reshaped the household's understanding of endurance, dependency, and the fine line between necessity and habit. Beneath the glow of candlelight and the hush of winter, medicine had become a quiet architect of Victorian control. The house settled as though under contract. The Christmas season, with its ceremonies, carols, and candlelight, demanded more than mere attendance. It demanded presence, attentive, composed, unbroken by fatigue or emotion. Peace was the currency of success, and in Victorian households it was often purchased, not with coin nor with gifts, but with powders, tinctures, and draughts, quietly administered in measured doses. Cocaine and opium moved through drawing rooms and nurseries like invisible servants, ensuring order without fanfare. Morning light revealed the subtle effectiveness of these interventions. Servants moved through halls without complaint. Children slept or played in tolerable moderation. Guests rose to polite conversation rather than chaotic bursts of restlessness. The household had been softened, arranged, and tuned. The appearance of calm was complete. It was a peace born of necessity. The chemical supports provided relief from winter fatigue, from long hours of engagement, from the pressure to perform. Energy returned where exhaustion threatened. Calm arrived where nerves were frayed. The body obeyed, the mind complied, and social rituals continued uninterrupted. The season's mechanical rhythm, the succession of meals, visits, music, and discourse remained intact. Mothers, especially, relied upon these quiet interventions. Christmas demanded their attention continuously. Children's needs, guests' expectations, and the meticulous orchestration of household appearance left little room for natural respite. The powders and draughts smoothed the sharp edges of responsibility. They softened exhaustion and muted anxiety, allowing women to maintain composure while fulfilling obligations that would otherwise have been impossible. Peace, therefore, was bought discreetly and carefully, a necessary expenditure. The household itself absorbed this rhythm. Rooms smelled faintly of coal smoke, pine, and the chemical agents administered to maintain order. The air was warm yet weighted with the invisible effects of assistance. Every interaction was subtly influenced, every gesture eased by quiet intervention. Conversation, once laborious in late hours, flowed effortlessly. Laughter, carefully modulated, rose without strain. The illusion of natural cheer prevailed. The practice was socially sanctioned. Doctors endorsed it, chemists supplied it responsibly, family traditions reinforced it. The mechanism of control was invisible, yet acknowledged by all who partook. There was no stigma attached to the purchase of such peace, because it preserved propriety rather than undermining it. The household's composure became proof that the intervention was effective, appropriate, and even necessary. Yet beneath the veneer of stability, the cost accumulated. Bodies learned to depend on chemical reinforcement. Rest, alertness, calm qualities once intrinsic became contingent upon the powders and tinctures that had been offered. The line between temporary support and habitual necessity blurred gradually, imperceptibly. What began as a seasonal aid quietly reshaped domestic expectation. By the final days of the holiday, the household's operation seemed effortless. No one noted the subtle fatigue deferred, the tension smoothed, the nerves quieted. Peace had been purchased, and in its absence, it was now expected. The body, trained through repetition, anticipated intervention. The mind adjusted to regulation. Social rituals proceeded without interruption, upheld by invisible scaffolding. Christmas ended, yet the consequences persisted. Energy and calm had been manufactured, not earned. The illusion of natural order had been maintained, but the rhythm of life had quietly shifted. Victorian households had discovered that peace could be bought, and once purchased, it could reshape expectation, dependency, and the very meaning of composure. Beneath holly and candlelight, beneath laughter and carols, the season had taught a new form of control, subtle, invisible, and enduring. Christmas had ended, but its lessons lingered in the body and the household alike. The season, so tightly orchestrated, had demanded composure, attention, and endurance beyond natural limits. It had required alertness through long dinners, patience during extended visits, and cheer sustained through music and conversation. Fatigue, frayed nerves, and restless children had been smoothed away by the careful administration of chemical aids. Now, beneath the tinsel and garlands, a subtler phenomenon emerged: tolerance. Tolerance did not announce itself with spectacle. It arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the body adapted to repeated intervention. Cocaine, once invigorating in its novelty, began to feel necessary for the same effect. Opium, once soothing, now required precise measurement to achieve calm. The household learned, unconsciously at first, that natural endurance was insufficient to meet expectation. Relief was no longer optional, it was anticipated. The change was particularly evident in mothers. Those who had moved seamlessly through the holiday's demands now felt the absence of chemical assistance sharply. Sleep was restless. Patience frayed more quickly. Children's energy, once manageable, became overwhelming. The domestic balance that had seemed effortless during Christmas evenings now required careful recalibration. The body remembered the previous ease and found the unassisted self lacking. Children, too, adjusted. They learned patterns of expectation. Moments of quiet would follow intervention. Bursts of activity could be softened chemically. Behavior became partially contingent upon the rhythms introduced by these aids. The nursery, once naturally chaotic, now moved in subtle alignment with the household's interventions. Tolerance extended outward, shaping interactions as well as internal sensation. Socially, tolerance reinforced dependence. Guests, accustomed to the brightness, alertness, and composure of hosts, found these qualities normalized. The appearance of energy and grace became standard. Any decline, natural fatigue, frayed attention, uneven moods was increasingly conspicuous. The household, conditioned by repeated assistance, was caught in an unspoken contract: perform or reveal deficiency. Chemical reinforcement thus became integrated into daily life. The bottles, vials, and powders that had once been reserved for exceptional moments were now routine. Dosage, timing, and measurement became a matter of habit, not ceremony. The body anticipated the intervention, learning to respond to expectation rather than internal signal. The line between support and requirement blurred slowly but decisively. This shift had implications beyond the physical. Emotion, perception, and judgment were subtly reshaped. Calm that had arrived naturally was now mediated. Alertness that had been intrinsic became contingent. The household's sense of stability was maintained, yet it was no longer entirely self-generated. Dependence, invisible and quiet, threaded itself through the daily rhythm. Even as winter pressed on, tolerance continued to evolve. Small increases in dose, subtle adjustments in timing, and repeated exposure ensured that the body could meet demands without revealing strain. Appearance, composure, and order were preserved. Society approved, morality remained intact, and the illusion of effortless grace persisted. Beneath the tinsel, then, a new hierarchy had been established. Those aided chemically operated at an elevated standard. The unassisted, natural human rhythm now seemed deficient. Success required reinforcement, yet reinforcement was invisible. Tolerance had become the quiet law of the household, dictating performance without declaration, conditioning body and mind alike to the expectation that the season and the year must be endured chemically as much as socially. By midwinter, the body bore the imprint of its accommodations. Long after the carols had faded and the last visitors departed, the household continued its measured rhythm. Fatigue that had once arrived predictably now lingered unevenly. Energy, when summoned chemically, felt fleeting. The natural cadence of movement and attention had been altered subtly, imperceptibly, until the body itself moved to a new, slower tempo. The limbs obeyed, but reluctantly. Muscles, conditioned by repeated performance under artificial enhancement, grew accustomed to assistance. Without it, their movements felt heavier, less precise. Hands trembled faintly when forced into labor. Feet hesitated during long walks. Even the act of sitting, standing, or bending required an unconscious negotiation between desire and capacity. The body had learned to expect help and reacted with mild resistance when it was absent. This slowing was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with collapse or pain. Instead, it whispered through endurance. Attention lagged, reflexes dulled, coordination faltered. Those accustomed to sharpness found themselves caught between expectation and reality. The contrast was subtle enough to remain socially invisible, yet intimate enough to be unmistakable to the individual. Mothers felt it first. The repeated demand of children, of domestic orchestration, of emotional management, pressed against muscles and nerves that had been stretched beyond natural capacity. A hand that once lifted with ease now quivered. A shoulder that had borne weight effortlessly now ached. Breath arrived shallowly after exertion. The subtlety of this fatigue made it difficult to acknowledge aloud. Victorian propriety discouraged complaint. Appearance remained paramount, so the slowed body was managed silently. Chemical reinforcement became the invisible ally. A measured dose of stimulant restored agility. A small sedative eased tension. Energy returned, but not fully. Movement regained smoothness, but only temporarily. The cycle of assistance and depletion continued, quietly dictating daily life. Bodies were no longer guided solely by natural rhythm. They had adapted to intervention. Even social expectations reinforced the change. Guests, family, and acquaintances had grown accustomed to a certain level of alertness, composure, and grace. When these faltered, even slightly, the household perceived deficiency. Intervention was normalized and expected. The slowed body, left unaided, risked revealing inadequacy. Society rewarded smooth execution and subtle efficiency. The body complied under chemical and social pressure alike. Emotion, too, adapted. The slowed body produced slower responses. Joy arrived more measuredly, sorrow more dulled. Sensations were tempered, muted, reshaped by both chemical aid and repetition. Internal signals, fatigue, alertness, tension, became negotiable, mediated through substances and expectation rather than accepted as natural. By midwinter, the pattern had become self-perpetuating. The body anticipated assistance before need arose. Movements, gestures, and attentions aligned with the schedule of reinforcement. Natural rhythm was subordinated to artificially sustained performance. The household operated seamlessly, yet beneath the surface, the physical organism had shifted. Victorian observers saw only the grace, the order, the calm composure of the house. They did not perceive the subtle slowing that underlay it, the private negotiation of body and mind, or the quiet dependence that had taken hold. The season had left its mark not only on ritual and expectation, but on the body itself, slowed, conditioned, and perpetually anticipating assistance that would always arrive too late to be noticed. Morning arrived, but it did not feel like morning. The house, once humming with expectation and the quiet brilliance of chemical assistance, now seemed suspended between yesterday and today. Light filtered weakly through frost-laced windows, softening furniture into blurred outlines. The air carried the residue of coal smoke, pine, and the faint chemical scent that had become so familiar. It was a morning both real and unreal, a threshold between performance and consequence. The body, conditioned by weeks of intervention, moved with mechanical precision. Limbs obeyed without protest, but sensation lagged behind. Hands lifted teacups with ease, but the warmth did not register fully. Feet carried occupants down staircases and across floors, yet the weight of gravity was felt more than the pleasure of movement. Even breathing, so ordinarily unnoticed, seemed slower, more deliberate, as though each inhale required subtle negotiation. Emotion, too, had been muted. Joy, anticipation, the thrill of celebration, all were present only as vestiges. Smiles were practiced, not felt. Voices carried tone and inflection, but the effective weight behind words was diminished. Children awoke with the same energy as any morning, yet their cries and laughter failed to stir the same warmth that memory suggested should exist. Mothers moved among them, calm and composed, yet the usual tenderness felt attenuated, filtered through layers of fatigue and chemical mediation. Breakfast proceeded as ritual dictated. Dishes were prepared and consumed, compliments exchanged, small complaints managed. Conversation flowed, but lacked the spark of genuine delight. The body performed its duties, the mind its functions, but the heart remained distant. Time seemed to pass with a curious, detached rhythm, neither quick nor slow, neither engaging nor entirely dull. This detachment was a consequence of repeated chemical reinforcement. Sleep had been mediated, energy artificially supplied, calm chemically induced. The body had learned to expect intervention for every function, alertness, movement, emotion. Now, in the quiet aftermath, it was aware of the absence, even as it continued to act. The mind noted the hollowness, but protocol demanded execution. The body moved, the household functioned, and society observed only success. The paradox was striking. Everything appeared perfect, yet nothing felt entirely authentic. The composure and efficiency that defined the household had been preserved, but the natural pleasure of engagement had been deferred again, until it risked vanishing entirely. Chemical support had sustained appearances, but at the cost of genuine experience. Some attempted small interventions, another drop here, a brief stimulant there to restore sensation. Relief arrived, but it was always fleeting. The body, accustomed to assistance, registered only temporary restoration. The mind remembered what had been, but could not summon it without aid. The distinction between natural and manufactured experience had become difficult, if not impossible, to discern. In this state, the household moved through the morning with quiet precision. Duties were completed, guests were received, smiles were offered, laughter sounded appropriate. Yet beneath the polite choreography, the body and mind were suspended between authenticity and artificiality. The season had been preserved, the household maintained, and the illusion of Christmas upheld. By mid-morning, the full weight of this paradox became apparent. Time continued. Tasks multiplied. The body obeyed, the mind calculated, and the heart remained distant. Christmas morning had arrived as scheduled, but without feeling, without depth, and without the warmth that memory promised. The season's brilliance persisted, but the essential human experience had been softened, mediated, and reshaped, leaving only the ghost of celebration in its place. By the time the last candle flickered out, the household had settled into a curious rhythm. Christmas, with its demands of composure, cheer, and endurance, had ended as planned, leaving behind the debris of celebration pine needles on polished floors, coal dust in the corners, and the lingering echo of carols in tall, empty rooms. Yet one element remained persistent, almost unnoticed: the bottle. It sat quietly on the sideboard or tucked safely in a cabinet, its presence both benign and commanding. It was no longer seasonal. It had become necessary. The bottle's contents, whether opium or cocaine, had been relied upon throughout the festivities to maintain order. It had smoothed fatigue, sharpened conversation, quieted unrest. It had preserved appearances when natural resources failed, stabilizing both the body and household with discreet efficiency. And now, after the last visitor had departed, it waited silently, its purpose unchanged. Morning revealed its influence subtly. Limbs moved with ease, but sensation was dulled. Minds engaged, but feelings lingered at the edges. The household functioned, yet awareness remained half-distant. The body had grown accustomed to this support. The mind anticipated it. The bottle, ever present, served as both safety net and expectation. Mothers found its presence comforting. The children had settled. The house remained calm. Yet without the occasional intervention from its contents, small tremors appeared. Irritability in response to minor disturbances, hands that shook faintly while performing repetitive tasks, and attention that flagged without warning. The bottle, when opened, restored alignment. Even a single measure rebalanced the day, granting composure and focus as effortlessly as turning a key. The pattern was subtle but unrelenting. Repeated exposure reshaped natural rhythms. Sleep, once restorative without assistance, now relied upon chemical aid. Energy, once generated naturally, became contingent upon dosage. Emotional balance, once instinctive, was moderated and guided by the contents of the glass or vial. The household had learned to depend on the bottle, just as the body had learned to anticipate it. Socially, its presence was invisible. Visitors saw only calm, order, and polished interaction. Guests noted the composure of mothers, the attentiveness of children, the efficiency of household routines. None observed the underlying dependency, nor the quiet negotiation between body, mind, and chemical aid. The bottle's influence was entirely private, yet its effects were woven into every facet of domestic life. Over time, its necessity grew imperceptibly. Occasional measures became routine. Daily usage, once unthinkable, became practical. The bottle no longer represented indulgence, but maintenance. Its contents were not celebrated, yet neither were they questioned. They had been validated repeatedly by the season's demands, by social expectation, and by the comforting approval of medical authority. Even as winter deepened and Christmas became memory, the bottle remained. It waited for moments of strain, for lapses in composure, for fatigue that naturally occurred in the absence of festivity. Its purpose had shifted from temporary support to constant scaffolding. The household, accustomed to its presence, could not imagine operating without it. In this quiet way, the bottle reshaped the season and the self. It extended the holidays into every day, creating a new rhythm where endurance was chemically mediated and composure was perpetually preserved. Christmas had ended, but the bottle, steadfast and waiting, ensured that the season's demands would never fully release their hold. It stayed open, as always, guiding the household and the body toward an invisible, inescapable equilibrium. The first weeks of January arrived with an air of stark reality. Christmas, with its gaslight, carols, and chemical assistance, had passed, leaving behind polished surfaces and the faint aroma of pine, wax, and medicinal tinctures. Yet the body, long accustomed to intervention, was unprepared for the sudden absence of festive indulgence. What had been managed with powders and draughts now asserted itself unmediated. Fatigue, irritability, and the subtle tremors that had been deferred during celebration returned with insistence. The household felt the shift immediately. Limbs moved with greater effort. Faces lacked the habitual composure. Smiles faltered. Voices carried hints of strain. Tasks that had once seemed manageable during the heightened rhythm of the season now appeared laborious. Attention flagged in subtle but unmistakable ways. The body, trained to expect chemical support, protested in private. Mothers were first to sense the imbalance. The children, whose energy had been moderated throughout the holiday, now demanded full attention. Rooms that had been quietly orderly erupted with movement and noise. Hands shook faintly while performing domestic duties. Shoulders ached with the simple weight of daily tasks. Even breathing, so often overlooked, arrived with a heavy rhythm. Winter, previously navigated with assistance, now exposed the limits of endurance. The phenomenon was mirrored in social perception. Guests who visited during the holiday had been impressed by the effortless grace of hosts, the calm engagement of children, the smooth running of the household. Without intervention, that appearance was harder to sustain. The household's previously invisible scaffolding of chemical aid was absent, yet its absence made itself known in slight delays, faint irritations, and the subtle stiffness of posture. Chemical intervention, previously confined to holiday excess, became a necessary tool once again. Small doses of stimulant lifted fogged attention. Gentle sedatives eased nerves frayed by the abrupt return of responsibility. The household adapted quickly. The powder and draughts restored rhythm, yet in doing so confirmed a new dependence. Relief, though temporary, underscored the body's expectation that assistance was no longer optional. Doctors reinforced this understanding. Winter, they noted, extended beyond the festival. Modern life remained taxing. Nervous systems required care, not just for crisis but for continuity. Assistance was not indulgent, it was preventative. Families accepted this quietly, unremarkably. The language of propriety and medicine intertwined seamlessly, obscuring the boundary between temporary support and ongoing necessity. Children, too, adjusted. Their restlessness, once mitigated during the holiday, returned. Feeding, play, and attention demanded more effort. The household, guided by prior experience, intervened chemically to restore calm. Order was achieved once again, and with it, the illusion that the household had never faltered. Yet the cost was now apparent in subtle ways. Sleep, previously natural, had become mediated. Attention relied on reinforcement. Emotional response, dulled and moderated, felt muted. The household functioned, but authenticity was sacrificed for composure. January's quiet days revealed that the seasonal scaffolding had become permanent, and the body had been trained to anticipate it. By the end of the first week, the lesson was undeniable. Winter was not Christmas, and yet it demanded the same measures to maintain order. The powder and draughts, once temporary allies, had become essential, shaping the rhythm of domestic life long after the last carol had faded. January's reckoning was both subtle and absolute. Endurance required intervention, and the body had learned that it could not rely upon itself alone. Even authority, carefully cultivated and long trusted, is not immune to uncertainty. In the quiet days following Christmas, physicians who had long sanctioned chemical intervention in the household began to notice patterns that defied easy explanation. Families returned more frequently than expected, seeking the same measured assistance that had sufficed during the holiday. Mothers appeared composed yet strangely subdued, their energy artificially maintained, their fatigue quietly magnified once the effects of a previous dose had worn off. Children, who had been soothed with gentle precision, seemed less resilient in their natural rhythms. And the doctors, observers from a distance of social propriety and clinical detachment, began to question what they had once considered benign. These were subtle doubts, appearing first in private conversations and cautious reflections. Could the body truly require repeated reinforcement? Were the nervous systems as fragile as previously described, or had the expectation of assistance created new dependency? Had the intervention preserved decorum at the cost of natural rhythm, autonomy, and adaptation? The questions, whispered among colleagues or pondered in study, carried a weight that could not be easily addressed aloud. Social and medical authority depended upon confidence. Doubt, even private, was dangerous. The pattern of returning households reinforced the unease. Families requested more frequent support than reason dictated. The powders and tinctures, initially intended to bridge temporary gaps, now seemed to sustain a continuous rhythm of reliance. Sleep had been chemically mediated, attention sharpened artificially. Emotional equilibrium had been guided and smoothed by administration. What had been framed as correction appeared increasingly as need. In their private studies, physicians observed the subtle signs: hands that trembled faintly without intervention, patience that flagged under ordinary strain, voices that lost tone without reinforcement. Children, too, exhibited dependence upon routine measures. Even the mothers, whose composure had been the benchmark of household success, displayed fatigue more pronounced when aid was delayed. The very success of chemical management made its necessity more visible. Some doctors attempted to reconcile these observations with existing theory. Perhaps the winter months were longer than accounted for, the social demands of the holiday season persisting into January, February, and beyond. Perhaps the body's sensitivity to fatigue and the mind's sensitivity to expectation were greater than previously understood. They re-examined dosage, timing, and method. adjusting recommendations to account for what appeared to be emerging patterns of extended reliance. Yet even as they offered reassurance, uncertainty lingered. The line between therapeutic support and habitual requirement had blurred. Intervention maintained appearance, but it could no longer be confidently stated that the household, or the individuals within it, would function without it. The subtle erosion of natural rhythm became evident, but socially invisible. Success was preserved, while dependence was quietly reinforced. By midwinter, physicians understood that their authority, while still intact in appearance, was no longer absolute in consequence. The very practices they had endorsed to preserve composure had begun to shape bodies, expectations, and habits in ways that could not be fully controlled. Their confidence remained intact publicly, yet privately they acknowledged a disquieting truth. Intervention, once temporary, now governed rhythms that had once been natural. And so, in the quiet of their studies, among ledgers, powders, and lecture notes, doctors began to doubt not openly, for that would threaten propriety, but in the private spaces of reflection, where the cost of intervention became impossible to ignore. The household ran smoothly. The holiday season had been preserved. Yet beneath the surface, even those entrusted with authority could see that the quiet scaffolding they had supplied was no longer merely optional, it had become indispensable. The veneer of Victorian propriety was thin, though carefully polished. Throughout December, drawing rooms gleamed under gaslight, Christmas trees stood perfectly decorated, fires glowed warmly, and the household moved in seamless harmony. Every gesture, every conversation, every glance had been orchestrated to convey composure, control, and refinement. Yet beneath this polished exterior, the strain was mounting, quietly but relentlessly. The household, trained to endure the season's demands, now faced the subtle cost of its own expectations. Limbs ached with repeated exertion, nerves frayed under constant attention. Sleep, when it came, was mediated by powders and drafts. Even those who had appeared tireless during the holiday, mothers, hosts, attendants, found their endurance tested in ways that could not be fully acknowledged. The machinery of propriety relied increasingly upon chemical reinforcement. Children, once soothed by careful scheduling and occasional sedatives, began to push limits unconsciously. Their energy, now less restrained by novelty or festivity, tested the patience of even the most composed mother. The nursery, previously a controlled domain, became a site of subtle unrest. Small tremors of fatigue in mothers were amplified by the children's demands. The household's rhythm, once assured, became more fragile. Guests, too, unwittingly contributed to the strain, arriving with expectations of charm, attention, and conversation. They required hosts to perform continuously, to maintain grace without pause. A moment of distraction or hesitation, previously imperceptible, now seemed pronounced, a reminder of the human body's limits. The household learned that the cost of appearance had real consequences, even if invisible to outsiders. Chemical interventions continued to bridge the gap. Stimulants lifted attention, sedatives eased nerves, and both were administered with precision. Yet each use carried subtle reinforcement of dependence. Relief was temporary. The body, having learned the rhythm of assistance, expected it as a matter of course. Natural responses to fatigue, tension, or emotional overload had been suppressed, deferred, and, increasingly, replaced. This strain manifested internally before it appeared outwardly. Heartbeats remained quickened from anticipation, even when the household appeared calm. Muscles held residual tension long after the body had been chemically aided. Thoughts moved with the precision demanded by decorum, yet lacked the spontaneity and lightness that had once accompanied natural energy. The mind learned to comply rather than respond. Even the social fabric reflected the pressure. Polite conversation, decorum, and attention were preserved at the cost of authenticity. Compliments were offered, smiles maintained, gestures executed flawlessly, but each required effort, now reinforced by chemical scaffolding. The appearance of harmony persisted, yet beneath it, subtle dissonance had taken root. By mid-January, the household began to recognize the permanence of these patterns. What had been seasonal support had become structural. Endurance, composure, and grace were no longer innate. They were assisted. The strain was real, even if invisible, and the reliance on powders and drafts was both a solution and a new expectation. Victorian society, ever attentive to appearances, praised the household's continued success. Outsiders saw only order, composure, and refinement. Few could imagine the private effort, the chemical mediation, or the subtle fatigue that underlay every smile, every conversation, every gesture. The season had ended, yet the labor of maintaining respectability endured, quietly, persistently, and invisibly, under the shadow of chemical and social expectation. The body is patient, but not without memory. Weeks of chemical assistance, continuous performance, and social expectation had pushed it to comply beyond natural limits. It had followed the rhythm of powder and draft, responding obediently to stimulant or sedative as directed. Yet, beneath the surface, the organic self began to assert itself. A quiet revolt emerged, subtle and unannounced, refusing to disrupt appearances, yet impossible to ignore internally. Limbs no longer moved effortlessly. Muscles resisted the familiar gestures of hospitality and attention. Hands trembled faintly, as though protesting the repeated imposition of composure. A simple task, a teacup lifted, a letter addressed, a child soothed, required negotiation between intent and capability. The body, having been trained to act beyond its natural endurance, now demanded acknowledgement of its limits. Nerves, long stabilized by careful doses of stimulants and sedatives, exhibited tremors. Attention wavered unexpectedly, subtle cracks appearing in what had previously seemed unbreakable focus. Fatigue, once easily masked, manifested as heaviness in the chest, dullness in the eyes, and a slow retreat of warmth through the limbs. Even the rhythm of the breath, so often unnoticed, felt less obedient, shallow where it had been steady, hesitant where it had been natural. This quiet revolt was frustrating precisely because it remained invisible to others. Guests continued to find hosts composed, mothers continued to guide children with a practiced grace. The household moved with the appearance of smooth efficiency. Social expectations were met, appearances preserved. Yet internally, every action required effort beyond its apparent ease. The discrepancy between perception and sensation became a constant, low hum of tension. Emotion, too, bore the marks of this rebellion. The mind registered unease that did not correspond with the cheerful expressions maintained for society. Patience, artificially prolonged, strained under repeated demand. Responses, previously fluid, now arrived delayed, calculated, effortful. Desire, attention, and delight were mediated through fatigue and expectation, leaving the conscious self-aware of its own diminished autonomy. Attempts to compensate only reinforced the cycle. Small doses of stimulant temporarily restored energy. A brief sedative eased tension. The household continued to function, yet the body, now anticipating intervention, learned to rely upon it. Natural resilience weakened, supplanted by artificial scaffolding. The revolt was quiet, cumulative, persistent. It did not break the household's outward rhythm, but it undermined the self's internal authority. Physicians, observing these households in passing, occasionally noted subtle signs: tremors, restlessness, pallor, fluctuating mood. Yet they interpreted them within the acceptable framework of winter strain, modern life, or nervous constitution. The revolt remained largely unacknowledged, existing only in the intimate awareness of the individual. hidden beneath layers of propriety, expectation, and chemical management. By midwinter, the lesson became unavoidable. Compliance had been purchased, but at a cost. The body resisted silently, testing limits, asserting needs, demanding consideration. Even as appearances remained flawless, the internal self quietly rebelled, reminding the household that endurance had boundaries and that no facade could fully mask the demands of the organic self. The quiet revolt did not demand interruption of the social order, it demanded acknowledgement. Yet in Victorian society, acknowledgement without compromise was impossible. The household pressed on, the body protested softly, and the powders and draughts continued to mediate between the two, sustaining appearances while the self learned to negotiate its own rebellion in silence. The demands of Victorian society were relentless, but they fell with particular weight upon women. From the moment the first carol echoed through frost-laden streets to the final extinguishing of candlelight, they were expected to maintain composure, grace, and attention without interruption. Christmas intensified this pressure. Every guest observed, every child required guidance, every task demanded perfection. A woman's endurance was measured not only by visible achievement, but by the absence of falter, an absence that was increasingly sustained through chemical means. Cocaine sharpened, opium softened. The combination allowed performance to continue, smoothing fatigue and dulling the strain of attention. Mothers moved through rooms with unwavering patience, hosts managed conversation with effortless charm, and children were soothed without audible distress. The household appeared balanced, flawless, uninterrupted. Yet beneath this surface, the body's natural limits had been overridden repeatedly, quietly, imperceptibly. Over time, the relief became expectation. Each dose, administered discreetly, trained the body to anticipate intervention. Fatigue, once natural and unavoidable, became intolerable. Calm and focus, once intrinsic, now required reinforcement. Sleep, emotional regulation, attention, all were mediated. The artificial rhythm became normal. The house functioned, but the self depended. The most insidious aspect of this pattern was its invisibility. Outsiders noted only success, the mother who guided children with patience, the hostess whose smiles never faltered, the household that operated seamlessly. No one observed tremors beneath silk gloves, subtle irritability masked by cordiality, or the quiet reliance on powders and draughts. The performance was flawless, the struggle was hidden. Women themselves internalized this necessity. To pause, to falter, to resist intervention, felt like failure. Composure was moral currency, and reliance on chemical assistance was reframed as propriety rather than indulgence. Each dose reinforced obedience not just to social expectation, but to the altered rhythms of the body itself. Relief became habit, and habit became invisible necessity. The children learned the pattern as well. Restless energy that might have tested maternal patience was soothed chemically, shaping expectation for both mother and child. The household adapted to this intervention, normalizing it. By the end of the season, dependence was fully integrated into daily life, unremarked and quietly essential. Even when the holidays concluded and the decorations were stored, the rhythm persisted. The body, trained to rely upon assistance, resisted returning to natural function. Sleep arrived unevenly, attention wavered without reinforcement, and patience frayed subtly but insistently. Chemical support had been internalized as part of daily existence. Women could not stop, not without consequence, not without noticing a deficit in their own capacity to maintain appearance, and not without feeling the quiet threat of social judgment. Physicians and chemists, having observed and facilitated these routines, rarely intervened. The household continued to appear orderly. The moral narrative of propriety remained intact. Dependency, though present, was invisible. excused by custom and expectation, and reinforced by the very structures of domestic life. By midwinter, it was evident. Women had been trained not only to endure but to require endurance artificially. Their bodies, once sovereign, now obeyed expectation mediated by powder and draught. Composure was no longer innate. It was chemically ensured. The holidays had ended, but the system, the expectation, the assistance, the dependency remained. Women could not stop, for the body had learned to depend, and society would not allow them to falter. The house continued to function seamlessly, sustained by invisible intervention, while the self quietly negotiated the boundaries between necessity and autonomy beneath the polite façade of order. While much attention was paid to the composure and endurance of women, men too found themselves ensnared by the subtle demands of Victorian society. Christmas, with its long evenings, extended meals, and expectations of charm, wit, and hospitality, required performance beyond mere presence. A gentleman was expected to converse effortlessly, to host without fatigue, to display a mastery of both intellect and social grace. Yet the demands of decorum, magnified by chemical intervention, soon revealed their cost. Cocaine, administered discreetly, sharpened speech and sustained attention. Opium, carefully timed, smoothed nerves frayed by long hours and excessive responsibility. The combination allowed men to meet expectations without faltering visibly. At dinner tables, they displayed wit without exhaustion, energy without aggression, and attentiveness without visible strain. Guests observed success. No one detected the subtle scaffolding that made it possible. The effect was seductive. The body, conditioned by repeated doses, came to anticipate assistance. Fatigue that might once have served as a natural signal to rest or withdraw was now perceived as inconvenience. Energy that was artificially supplied felt necessary. The line between capability and dependence blurred gradually, imperceptibly, until the self could no longer distinguish between natural alertness and chemically mediated performance. Yet the strain persisted internally. Muscles resisted subtly, the heart beat with an undercurrent of tension, and attention, while externally sustained, faltered in private moments. Emotional responses, mediated by opium or stimulant, lacked depth. Pride, anxiety, and fatigue were muted, replaced by a managed equilibrium that preserved appearance at the expense of authenticity. Men performed flawlessly for society, but beneath the surface, their bodies signaled rebellion, reminding them that endurance had limits. The pressure to continue was compounded by social expectation. Observers noted composure, precision, and energy, reinforcing the need for sustained performance. Any lapse risked exposure, subtle as it might be. A faltered word, a pause too long, a gesture lacking confidence. In such moments, reliance on chemical support was not indulgence, but necessity. The gentleman who could not perform risked social scrutiny, moral judgment, and the quiet erosion of reputation. As the holiday season progressed, the body's dependence solidified. Stimulants became integrated into daily life, taken to restore sharpness, concentration, and courage. Opioids offered calm when nerves threatened composure. The rhythm of assistance dictated behavior. Wakefulness, alertness, and emotional balance were now contingent, not spontaneous. The gentleman's performance was chemically assured. Even after Christmas passed, the expectations remained. Work resumed, society demanded engagement, and the rituals of daily life required the same composure once maintained for the drawing room and dinner table. The body, trained by weeks of intervention, struggled to function naturally. Fatigue returned more quickly, patience faltered sooner, and the quiet tremors of overextension became familiar companions. Physicians, having sanctioned use during the holiday, rarely questioned the continuation of intervention. Social norms reinforced the practice. framing chemical support as responsible maintenance rather than indulgence. The household continued to operate smoothly, appearances held, and the gentleman remained capable in public view while privately negotiating the toll of artificial performance. By midwinter, the reality was clear. Men, like women, had become bound to a rhythm that extended beyond natural capacity. Performance, once a measure of talent or virtue, now depended upon powder and draught. The season had ended, yet the necessity persisted. The body had adapted, the mind had learned, and the social expectation of composure had ensured that a gentleman could not cease, even if the cost remained invisible, profound, and unacknowledged. The truth of Christmas was rarely admitted aloud. Behind the gaslight, the polished silver, and the carefully arranged greenery, the holiday had become a carefully maintained illusion. Households operated with flawless precision, children were soothed into obedience, and adults maintained composure that seemed effortless. Yet, beneath this surface, fatigue, irritability, and dependence had accumulated, hidden from view. The season's cheer, so widely admired, was built upon a quiet scaffolding of chemical and social enforcement. By mid-January, the façade began to show its subtle cracks. The stimulants that had sharpened conversation now yielded only partial clarity. Opium, which had soothed nerves and dulled exhaustion, left lingering dullness and disrupted natural rhythms. The body, trained to anticipate assistance, rebelled slightly when it was delayed. Tremors appeared in hands, irritability flared in response to minor disruptions, and patience, once seemingly infinite, eroded with quiet insistence. The perfection of the season had been maintained, but the cost was now undeniable. For families, recognition of this cost was uncomfortable. Mothers noted how exhaustion returned more swiftly, how the children's energy seemed less manageable, how their own composure required repeated reinforcement. Fathers observed subtle tremors in speech, lapses in attention, moments of restlessness that could not be smoothed by social expectation alone. The household realized that the balance achieved during December had been artificial, dependent on powders and drafts, rather than natural resilience. Even servants and observers noticed deviations from the previous order. Footsteps were slower, tasks took marginally longer, the air in drawing rooms felt heavier with tension than it had in the glow of the holiday. The rhythm that had been meticulously orchestrated during Christmas no longer sustained itself effortlessly. The lie of uninterrupted cheer and composure was revealed in minor, yet unmistakable signs. Chemical assistance, once a temporary measure, had embedded itself into the daily routine. The powders and tinctures had altered the household's internal timing. Sleep, attention, and emotion were no longer purely natural. Relief had become expectation. Assistance was anticipated before need arose. The dependence was quiet, invisible to casual observers, yet profoundly shaping behavior. This revelation prompted unease among the household's more reflective members. The season's perfection had been sustained by intervention, and the illusion of effortless cheer had masked the true labor required. Social rituals, the polished performances admired by guests and neighbors, had obscured the fact that human capacity had been exceeded and artificially maintained. The moral and aesthetic ideals of Christmas, the very image of propriety and refinement, were inseparable from chemical scaffolding. Physicians, whose approval had legitimized intervention, were silent. They had endorsed assistance during the holiday, rationalizing it as necessary and temporary. Now, with dependence entrenched, the unintended consequences became evident, yet no authority stepped forward to acknowledge them. The household was left to confront, privately, the realization that the season's brilliance had been purchased, not naturally achieved. The exposure of this Christmas lie was both humbling and disquieting. The appearance of effortless composure, of disciplined attention, of harmonious domestic life, had been maintained at the cost of natural rhythm, emotional authenticity, and bodily autonomy. The truth, quietly acknowledged in private, revealed that the household had been performing not merely for society, but for the chemical scaffolding that had enabled its performance. By the end of January, the lesson was clear. The perfection of Christmas had never been innate. It had been engineered, maintained, and enforced. Beneath holly and candlelight, beneath carols and social expectation, the lie of seamless cheer had been exposed not through scandal or collapse, but through the subtle, undeniable awareness of bodies, minds, and habits forever altered. The distinction between treatment and habit blurred with each passing day. What had begun as a carefully measured intervention, a solution for fatigue, nerves, or the prolonged demands of festive obligation, had quietly evolved into expectation. Cocaine sharpened thought, opium soothed anxiety, laudanum ensured sleep, and each administration reinforced the household's reliance upon these substances. The body, trained by repetition, learned to anticipate relief. What was medicine in December became habit by midwinter. This transformation was subtle and insidious. No single event marked the shift. There was no dramatic dependence, no visible collapse, no scandal. The powders and drafts continued to arrive on schedule, discreetly and respectfully, preserving appearances while altering internal rhythm. The household operated flawlessly. Social observers perceived only composure, attentiveness, and domestic success. Yet the underlying reality had changed entirely. Women, in particular, experienced the transition keenly. Mothers who had relied on brief doses to sustain holiday duties now found themselves unable to meet even ordinary demands without assistance. Children's energy, previously managed with a few measured interventions, now required regular reinforcement. Each day reinforced the pattern. Without chemical aid, the body struggled. With it, performance returned. Habit, once imperceptible, had taken hold. Men, too, felt the subtle encroachment. Conversation faltered without stimulant, nerves frayed without sedative, and attention waned at the precise moment it was expected to shine. The appearance of competence remained intact only through continued administration. What had been occasional support became routine maintenance. The line between intervention and necessity had disappeared entirely. The household learned to navigate this new reality quietly. Intervention was no longer framed as optional. It was not merely aid, it was expectation. The rhythm of daily life had adapted to chemical scaffolding, and withdrawal, even temporary, was noticeable in subtle tremors, lapses in attention, or shifts in mood. Reliance was discreet, yet unmistakable to those attuned to the body's signals. Physicians observed the transition without alarm. The substances were administered within controlled parameters, dosages remained modest, and appearances of propriety persisted. The logic of medicine legitimized the habit. Relief was framed as treatment, not indulgence, masking the ongoing adaptation of the body to repeated intervention. Habit, silent and invisible, was rationalized as care. The household, now conditioned, moved seamlessly between day and night. Sleep was assisted, energy was mediated. Emotional regulation relied upon chemical reinforcement. Each member, knowingly or not, adjusted expectations around the availability of support. Fatigue, tension, and distress were no longer cues for rest or reflection. They were signals that intervention was needed. What had been temporary had become structural. Even as winter deepened, the habit persisted. The season's artificial rhythms extended into ordinary days. Chemical assistance dictated behavior as much as social expectation. Bodies learned to obey externally imposed schedules rather than their own intrinsic cues. Performance became inseparable from intervention. By late January, the reality was undeniable. The household functioned flawlessly, yet internal dependence had solidified. The transition from medicine to habit was complete. What had been intended as temporary, corrective, and necessary for the holidays had become routine, shaping not only the body's response but the household's understanding of normality. Christmas had ended, yet its chemical legacy endured, quietly orchestrating attention, energy, and emotion long after the last carol had faded. When the final guest had departed, and the drawing rooms lay empty beneath the soft glow of dying gaslight, the house exhaled. Christmas, with its music, conversation, laughter, and ritualized cheer, had concluded. The rooms that had vibrated with attention and energy were now heavy with quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against windows, carrying frost and soot. Inside, only the faint scent of pine, wax, and residual chemical interventions lingered. The household, for the first time in weeks, was left to confront itself in the absence of spectacle, stimulation, and expectation. The silence was deceptive. It was not restful. It did not bring relief. Instead, it revealed the body's response to months of exertion sustained artificially. Muscles ached where they had been compelled to move, joints stiffened where they had been ordered to obey, and nerves, dulled or heightened by powders and tinctures, whispered their protest. The household's previous rhythm, maintained by chemical assistance, now collapsed into awareness of absence. Mothers felt the dissonance most acutely. Children, finally allowed to rest without intervention, required observation nonetheless, and the quiet revealed the strain accumulated over weeks. Limbs trembled slightly under the weight of fatigued attention. Eyes, previously sharpened by stimulants, now recorded the world with duller clarity. The mind struggled to reconcile expectation with the slowed reality of natural endurance. Composure, once preserved seamlessly, demanded conscious effort. Fathers experienced similar revelations. Conversations that had flowed smoothly with chemical support now encountered hesitation. Attention lagged. Words arrived with effort rather than spontaneity. Even gestures of charm and social grace, previously unbroken, now required negotiation between desire and capability. The subtle tremor of human limitation surfaced, visible only to the careful observer and experienced acutely by the individual. The children, too, registered the change. Where restlessness had been managed, the absence of reinforcement allowed bursts of energy or fatigue to surface unpredictably. Small conflicts, minor disturbances, and the return of natural impatience created a fragile rhythm within the house. It was a rhythm no longer guided by the steady hand of chemical scaffolding, and the household felt its effects as a quiet, persistent tension. In this silence, the body spoke plainly. Heartbeats, previously moderated by sedation or stimulation, carried their natural irregularity. Breaths deepened or faltered without prompt. Attention wavered. The nervous system, long guided externally, asserted its presence. What had been deferred during celebration now arrived in subtle, undeniable waves. Even the social mind responded. Memory and expectation collided. What had been achieved seamlessly during holiday performance now seemed remarkable in its absence. The perception of capability was heightened, precisely because it was now fragile, easily disrupted by natural limitation. The household recognized, consciously or not, that its previous mastery had depended upon intervention, that the calm, composure, and cheer of the season were in part chemically orchestrated. This revelation was both humbling and instructive. The quiet exposed reliance, challenged assumptions, and demonstrated the distance between appearance and internal reality. The body, previously compliant under the guidance of powder and draught, reminded the household of its autonomy. The self, long accustomed to performance, encountered limitation once more. By the end of this silent interlude, the lesson was evident. The holiday's brilliance had been temporary, its perfection purchased. Now, with the party concluded, the household confronted the consequence. The need for ongoing support, the the persistence of fatigue, and the subtle, persistent dissonance of performance artificially sustained. Silence, after the party, was not absence, it was revelation. It was the truth of endurance, exposed quietly, profoundly, and unavoidably. The garlands had begun to brown. Pine needles, once crisp and fragrant, now lay scattered across polished floors, crushed beneath boots and slippers. Wreaths drooped on doorways, their vibrant green dulled by time and frost. The fires burned lower, their flames consuming only embers, and the gaslights flickered faintly as though weary from weeks of illumination. The holiday had ended, yet its shadow lingered, thick with memory, expectation, and chemical trace. The household, accustomed to the rhythm of intervention, now moved through space defined by absence and residue. Cocaine had sharpened attention, opium had soothed nerves, laudanum had mediated sleep. Each substance had been measured, administered, and relied upon to maintain the seamless grace and composure that society demanded. And now, with the decorations fading, the body confronted the quiet truth. The season had been constructed, orchestrated, and chemically sustained. Appearance had endured, authenticity had been postponed. Mothers rose early, tending to tasks with hands that trembled faintly. Muscles stiffened, nerves still subtly frayed. The children, whose energy had been modulated during the holidays, now tested limits unmediated, creating uneven rhythms that revealed both dependence and adaptation. Fathers, hosts, and guests, those who had maintained composure through long conversations, prolonged attention, and social performance, found that without the regular scaffolding of stimulants and sedatives, the body's endurance was uneven, attention fractured, and patience fragile. The chemical scaffolding remained, quietly present on sideboards, tucked into cabinets, or measured in small vials behind locked drawers. Its presence was unremarkable, familiar, expected. The household relied upon it even when the holiday had passed. Relief arrived predictably, smoothing tremors, lifting attention, and quieting tension. Yet each administration served as a reminder. Natural rhythm had been subordinated to intervention, authenticity had been mediated, and endurance could not be trusted without assistance. Social expectations persisted despite the fading decorations. Guests arrived occasionally, unaware of the household's reliance on chemical support, yet assessing composure, attentiveness, and grace with the same exacting standards imposed during Christmas. To falter without explanation risked judgment, while the continued use of chemical aids allowed the household to maintain appearances seamlessly. Dependence, invisible to outsiders, was reinforced by necessity, etiquette, and habit. Physicians, chemists, and household authority figures had sanctioned this pattern, and their approval lent legitimacy. Intervention was not indulgence, it was maintenance. The body, trained by repetition, anticipated relief. Fatigue, nervous strain, and emotional unrest were no longer natural signals but prompts for intervention. The household functioned smoothly, yet the organic self was quietly constrained. Emotion and sensation, once fully accessible, were now tempered by intervention. Joy arrived measured, attention sharpened artificially, composure preserved chemically. The body moved efficiently, but the mind was aware of its own dependence. What had been celebrated as endurance was, in reality, sustained compliance. The season's brilliance had endured beyond ornamentation, not through intrinsic capacity, but through carefully administered substances. By the end of January, the lesson was clear. Evergreen, once a symbol of vitality and continuity, had faded in the cold, leaving behind its scent, but not its life. The season's performance, meanwhile, persisted, upheld by powders, drafts, and expectation. The household had survived, its social façade intact, yet the body and mind had been irrevocably altered. The brilliance of Christmas remained visible, even as the truth of its mediation remained invisible, quietly sustaining the rhythm of life long after the candles had burned low. Evergreen over ether. The season had ended, the intervention endured, and beneath it all, the household moved forward, obedient, composed, and subtly, irreversibly transformed.